I can make sure the men follow the rules. That is exactly what I need, Ned, Kaelen said, patting his brother's shoulder. I need a soul that cannot be corrupted. I need someone who can see the truth of a thing without being blinded by glory or gold. But while the siblings found their roles, the shadow of Maester Whaleys continued to loom over the keep. The maester had been effectively sidelined from the castle's major projects, relegated to the rookery and the library by Ricard's silent decree. Kaelen had seen to it that every letter Whaleys sent was intercepted by Harry's growing network of observers. The reports to the Citadel were becoming more frantic, filled with descriptions of grey stone that flows like water and armies that move with the precision of a clockwork toy. Kaelen stood in the Godswood late one night, the first mile of the concrete road completed and the Winter Guard now a formalized unit of 200 disciplined soldiers. The red leaves of the heart tree were dark in the moonlight, and the black pool was still as death. He is riding to the south again, Kaelen, Harry said, stepping out from behind the massive trunk of a weirwood tree. He sent a raven to Old Town an hour ago. He thinks I did not see him because I was in the barracks. Let him write, Harry, Kaelen said, his eyes fixed on the red, carved face of the tree. The more he writes, the more the Citadel will fear us. Fear is a useful tool. It keeps the foxes away from the den until we are strong enough to hunt them. And if they come with more than just letters? If the Iron Throne asks why the North is building roads of stone and arming commoners like knights. Kaelen turned, his white hair ghost-like in the darkness, his green eyes cold. Then they will find a North that is no longer made of mud and wood. They will find a North of concrete and wolf steel. They will find the Winter Guard standing on a road that does not end until the South is at our mercy. He thought of his mother, Lyra. He thought of her Look North Council. He had stabilized the foundations of his home, and he had founded the core of his pack. He was 11 years old, a child in body but a titan in spirit, and he was finally beginning to see the shape of the fortress he was building. As he walked out of the Godswood, his boots echoing on the new concrete path, Kaelen felt the weight of the future pressing down on him. But for the first time, he didn't feel as though he were carrying it alone. He had Brandon to lead, Ned to watch, and Harry to build. The pack was forming, and the White Wolf was ready to lead them into a light that the South could never extinguish. The year 273 AC was coming to a close. The Green Revolution was filling the granaries, the wolf steel was arming the men, and the First Road was pointing the way forward. Kaelen Stark looked up at the stars, the same stars he had known in another life, and he knew that the transformation was no longer a project. It was his destiny. Chapter 11, The Concrete Wolf. The year 274 AC was the year the North began to calcify. For thousands of years, the great keep of Winterfell had been held together by ancient mortar, gravity, and the sheer, stubborn will of the first men. But the weight of Kaelen's ambitions was starting to exceed the structural tolerances of the past. As the winter of 273 AC bled into a damp, grey spring, Kaelen stood in the flickering gloom of the castle's lowest levels, his white hair ghost-like in the torchlight. He was 12 years old, Brandon was 12, and Ned was 11. Between them, they represented the most educated and physically prepared generation of Starks in history, but Kaelen knew that without a solid foundation, their height would only make their eventual fall more devastating. He stood before a massive granite pillar that supported the weight of the first keep. A jagged, hairline fracture ran from the base up into the vaulted ceiling, a silent scream of overstressed stone. Kaelen ran his fingers over the crack, his mind calculating the load-bearing capacity and the shifting center of gravity. He wasn't just looking at stone, he was looking at the physical manifestation of his family's vulnerability. The volcanic ash is setting, Harry, Kaelen said, his voice echoing in the humid dark. I have increased the silicate ratio. This batch of concrete will not just fill the gaps. It will bond to the granite at a molecular level, creating a composite structure that can support twice the current weight. We are going to wrap every pillar in the lower levels. Harry Stone, now 15 and possessing the broad shoulders and steady hands of a master mason, nodded. He was covered in the fine grey dust of the lime works, his eyes red-rimmed from the fumes but filled with a profound, quiet loyalty. The men are ready with the forms, K. We can pour the 3 main supports by sunset. But the master of horse is complaining about the noise in the yard. He says the grinding of the stones is spooking the destriers. The master of horse can take his destriers to the Wolf's Wood if he finds the progress too loud, Kaelen replied, not looking up. I will not have this castle crumble because a few horses are skittish. We are pouring the future, Harry. Everything else is secondary. The reconstruction of Winterfell was Kaelen's primary focus for the first half of 274 AC. He utilized his Roman-style concrete to reinforce the ancient foundations, repair the decaying curtain walls, and build a system of internal flues that finally allowed the geothermal heat of the hot springs to circulate efficiently through every room in the Great Keep. It was a project of staggering logistical complexity, requiring the coordination of hundreds of laborers and the systematic testing of materials he had perfected in his nursery years. But Kaelen's mind was already wandering beyond the walls of Winterfell. He was thinking of the sea. In the solar that evening, Kaelen sat with his brothers and his father. Rickard Stark looked older since Lyra's passing, the grief etched into the lines around his mouth, but he watched his sons with a growing, silent pride. Brandon, 12 and a half, was currently cleaning his wolf steel dagger, his movements possessing a predatory grace. Ned, 11, was reading a ledger of the winter stores, his brow furrowed in concentration. The road to Wintertown is complete, Kaelen said, breaking the silence. But it is a road to a dead end. The north has 2 coasts, and yet we have no true presence on either. We rely on the Manderleys for our trade in the east and we have nothing but rocks and ironborn in the west. Rickard looked up from his wine. We have never been a seafaring people, Kaelen. The gods gave us the earth and the trees. The sea belongs to the ironmen and the traders of Bravus. The sea belongs to whoever has the best ships, father, Kaelen countered, leaning forward. He pulled a scroll from his belt and spread it across the table. It was a blueprint, drawn with a precision that made Rickard squint. This is the Wolf Runner. It is a galley, but it is not like the heavy, sluggish ships of the south. It features a deeper keel for stability in the northern swells and a lateen rig that allows it to sail closer to the wind. Brandon drifted over, his interest piqued. It looks fast. Can it carry the Winter Guard? It can carry 100 men and their equipment, Kaelen said. And it features a reinforced prow of wolf steel for ramming. But ships are useless without a port. White Harbor is too far south. We need a gate to the east. A place where the White Knife meets the sea. Wolf's Gate, Ned murmured, his eyes fixed on the map. You want to build a city? I want to build a fortress that breathes, Ned, Kaelen said. A naval base and a merchant hub. A place where the wealth of the north can flow out and the strength of the world can flow in. If we control the eastern coast, the Bravasi will be our partners, not our masters. And the sistermen will think twice before they raid a Stark ship. Rickard stood up, walking to the window to look out at the yard where the concrete road began. He thought of the prosperity Kaelen had brought in a mere decade, the glass, the steel, the food. He saw the logic in the boy's eyes, the cold, unyielding arithmetic of power. You are 12 years old, Kaelen, Rickard said softly. You should be thinking of your name day and your first hunt. Instead, you are building roads of stone and dreaming of cities on the sea. I am a Stark, father, Kaelen said, his voice steady. And the winter is coming. If I do not dream of the sea now, my children will drown in it later. Rickard turned back to the table, his hand resting on the blueprint of the Wolf Runner. The foundations of Winterfell come first. I want the first keep reinforced before the first frost. But you may begin the surveys for your city. Send Harry to the coast. See what the land says. The survey of the eastern coast took 2 moons. Kaelen did not go himself, he was too busy overseeing the concrete wolf project at the castle, but he sent Harry Stone with a group of outriders. When Harry returned, he brought samples of the soil and a detailed map of the coastline. "The location is perfect, Kaelen," Harry said as they sat in the research solar. "There is a natural deep water bay protected by a crescent of cliffs. The current is strong enough to keep the ice from freezing solid for most of the year. And there is a limestone quarry nearby that will provide all the aggregate we need for your concrete." Kaelen looked at the map, his mind already sketching the docks and the warehouses. "We will call it Wolf's Gate. It will be the premier port of the north. But first, we build the shipyard. I want the first 3 wolf runners in the water within 3 years. We need to train the sailors as we train the guard." While the plans for Wolf's Gate began to take shape, Kaelen also focused on the training of his brothers. Brandon and Ned were now fully integrated into the Winter Guard's drills, though their roles were as different as fire and earth. Brandon was the natural leader of the cavalry, his dark hair flying as he led charges across the training fields. He thrived on the speed and the impact, his wolf steel blade a blur of motion. Ned, however, had found his place in the heavy infantry. At 11, he was becoming a master of the shield wall. He understood the rhythm of the line, the way a dozen men became a single organism. Kaelen often watched him from the battlements, noting the way Ned would adjust the spacing of the men with a quiet, firm word. "He doesn't roar like Brandon," Harry noted one afternoon, standing beside Kaelen. "He doesn't need to," Kaelen replied. "Brandon is the fire that draws the eye, but Ned is the wall that ensures there is still a home when the fire burns out. They are the two halves of the North's survival." As 274 AC drew to a close, the Concrete Wolf project reached its conclusion. The foundations of Winterfell were reinforced, the ancient stones bound together by a grey binder that would outlast the memory of the men who poured it. The castle felt different, sturdier, warmer, and more permanent. Kaelen stood in the God's Wood on the last night of the year. The red leaves of the heart tree were silent in the moonlight. He looked at his hands, calloused from the work and stained with the grey dust of the lime. He was 12 years old, and he had secured the ground beneath his family's feet. "The foundations are set," Kaelen whispered to the red-faced tree. He thought of his mother, Lyra. He thought of her pride and her warnings. He had looked north. He had built the glass, the steel, and the stone. And now, he was turning his eyes toward the sea. The transformation was expanding, a grey tide of progress that would soon reach the very edges of the continent. The White Wolf was no longer just a boy with memories. He was the architect of a new age, and the world was finally beginning to realize that the North was no longer sleeping. It was building. Chapter 12, Spirits of the North. By the year 275 AC, the North had begun to shed its reputation as a vast, frozen wasteland of impoverished woodcutters and desperate mountain clans. The Stark Plenty, as the small folk had begun to call it, was no longer a localized miracle in Winterfell. The four-field system was spreading through the fertile lands of the Mander and the Umber, and the granaries were swelling with a surplus that the North had not seen in centuries. Kaelen Stark, now 13 years of age, stood in the center of his newest laboratory, a sprawling, copper-lined chamber situated near the thermal vents of Wintertown. He was no longer just a child with strange ideas, he was the primary architect of a regional economy, and his mind was currently fixed on the chemistry of distillation. Kaelen adjusted the glass thermometer he had meticulously ground and calibrated against the freezing point of water and the boiling point of spirits. Beside him, Harry Stone, now 16 and possessing the disciplined focus of an officer in the Winter Guard, monitored the pressure in a series of interconnected copper vessels. The air in the room was thick with the sweet, heavy scent of fermenting grain and the sharp, medicinal sting of high-proof alcohol. "The temperature must remain constant, Harry," Kaelen said, his voice carrying the calm, clinical authority that had become his trademark. "If we go too high, we carry over the heavy oils and the methanol, which tastes of rot and blinds the drinker. If we go too low, we lose the essence." We are looking for the heart of the run. The ethanol. The spirit of the grain itself. In his old life, the science of distillation was a fundamental of industrial chemistry. Here, it was a way to condense the North's agricultural surplus into a high-value commodity that was easily transported and virtually immune to spoilage. Wheat and barley were heavy and difficult to move across the rutted roads of the Seven Kingdoms, but a barrel of high-proof whiskey was worth more than its weight in gold in the ports of the free cities. Wolf's breath, Harry murmured, looking at the clear liquid dripping steadily from the copper worm into a charred oak barrel. The name is a bit aggressive, don't you think? The North is aggressive, Harry, Kaelen replied, a small smile touching his lips. It is a harsh land. Our spirits should reflect that. But it is not just for drinking. This is the foundation of our medicine. High-proof spirits for cleaning wounds, for tinctures, for the preservation of herbs. And for trade, it is the perfect weapon. We can sell this to the Bravasi for 3 times the cost of the grain used to make it. The development of the distillery was a strategic move designed to fund the next phase of Kaelen's master plan, the Northern Infrastructure Project. While the glass and steel provided the strength and the food provided the survival, the whiskey would provide the liquid capital necessary to pave the North. Outside the laboratory, the results of that capital were already visible. The first concrete road, a grey ribbon of unyielding man-made stone, now stretched from the gates of Winterfell toward the White Knife. It was a marvel of civil engineering. Kaelen had spent the early months of 275 AC perfecting the northern mix, a variant of his concrete that utilized local limestone aggregate and a higher ratio of volcanic ash to ensure flexibility during the extreme temperature shifts of the northern winters. As Kaelen walked through the yard toward the Great Keep, he saw his brothers. Brandon, now 13, was leading a mounted drill for the Winter Guard. He was a head taller than many of the grown men, his dark hair pulled back in a warrior's knot, his face holding a raw, predatory charisma. He sat his horse like he had been born in the saddle, his wolf-steel longsword gleaming in the pale sunlight. Beside him, 12-year-old Ned was coordinating the logistics of the supply wagons. Ned had found his niche not in the glory of the charge, but in the unyielding reality of the line. He understood the numbers. He understood that an army marched on its belly and its boots. He looked up as Kaelen approached, his grey eyes serious. The latest shipment of limestone from the Karstark lands is late, Ned said, not even bothering with a greeting. The road crews are sitting idle near the bridge. We are losing 2 days of progress. Kaelen stopped, looking at his younger brother. He felt a surge of pride. At 12, Ned was already taking on the responsibilities of a steward. The mud on the King's Road is likely to blame, Ned. This is exactly why we are building the new path. Send a message to the Karstark outriders. Tell them that if the stone isn't here by the next moon, I will deduct the cost of the idle labor from their next trade credit for the glass. Ned nodded, scribbling a note in his ledger. I'll see it done. Brandon rode over then, his destrier snorting and stamping the ground. You two are always talking about rocks and ledgers. Come to the yard, Kaelen. I want to show you the new formation. We can break a shield wall in under 3 minutes now. Breaking a wall is easy, Bran, Kaelen said, looking up at his twin. The trick is making sure the wall doesn't need to be broken in the first place. How is the guards' discipline? They're wolves, Brandon grinned, his eyes flashing. They don't need discipline. They need blood. They need both, Kaelen said firmly. A wolf that doesn't listen to the pack is a dead wolf. Remind them of that during the next drill. Brandon laughed and wheeled his horse around, heading back to the men. Kaelen watched him go, the twin bond a warm, persistent hum in the back of his mind. He knew Brandon was the fire that the North would rally behind, but he also knew that fire without a hearth was a destructive thing. In the Great Hall that evening, the first barrel of Wolf's Breath was presented to Rickard Stark. The hall was filled with the lords of the surrounding lands, the Searwins, the Tall Hearts, and the Glovers who had come to see the latest miracle of the White Wolf. Ricard took a small sip of the clear, ember-tinted liquid. His eyes widened as the heat hit the back of his throat, a smooth, smoky burn that tasted of peat, honey, and the very essence of the north. He let out a long, satisfied breath. "It is like drinking a campfire," Ricard said, a genuine smile breaking across his granite-hard face. "But it doesn't bite like the raw swill the traders bring from the south. It is refined. It is the distilled spirit of our fields, father," Kaelen said, standing before the assembled lords. "We have enough grain to feed our people, and now we have enough to sell the rest in a form that never rots. This whiskey will pay for the roads. It will pay for the bridges. It will make the north the center of trade between the east and the west." The lords clamored for a taste, and as the wolf's breath flowed, the mood in the hall shifted from skeptical caution to exuberant optimism. They saw the gold in the glass. They felt the strength in the steel. And now, they tasted the fire in the spirits. But as the celebration continued, Kaelen noticed a shadow in the corner. Maester Whaleys was watching the proceedings with a look of profound, icy distaste. He hadn't touched the whiskey. He sat with his hands tucked into his sleeves, his grey robes a stark contrast to the vibrant furs and the warm firelight. Kaelen excused himself from his father's side and walked toward the maester. "You do not approve of our spirits, maester?" Kaelen asked, his voice low and dangerous. Whaleys looked at the 13-year-old boy. He saw the white hair and the green eyes that seemed to hold the secrets of a dozen lifetimes. "I approve of order, young Kaelen. I approve of tradition. What you are doing, you are turning the north into a factory. You are replacing the ancient ways with the logic of the forge and the distillery. You think you are making them strong, but you are making them different. And different things are often destroyed by those who fear change. The ancient ways left my mother dead because you wouldn't use the new medicine, Whaleys," Kaelen said, his voice dropping to an icy whisper. "The ancient ways keep our people hungry while the south grows fat on our labor. I am not changing the north. I am waking it up. And if the south fears change, then they should be very, very afraid of me." Whaleys did not blink. "The Citadel has a long memory, child. They have watched empires rise and fall based on the very knowledge you are so recklessly handing out. You think you are the first to try and build a utopia of logic? You are not. And you will not be the last to see it burn." "Let it burn then," Kaelen said, turning his back on the maester. "As long as it burns with wolf's breath, we will be the ones who hold the torch." As 275 AC drew to a close, the north was a hive of activity. The first barrels of whiskey were being readied for export to Bravus. The concrete roads were stretching further into the Wolf's Wood, connecting the major keeps in a web of infrastructure that defied the seasons. The Winter Guard was expanding, its training becoming the gold standard for soldiers in the Seven Kingdoms. Kaelen stood on the battlements on the final night of the year, looking out at the sprawling lights of Wintertown. It was no longer just a village, it was becoming a city. He felt the weight of the memories in his head, the 10 billion years of struggle, and for the first time, he felt a sense of genuine peace. He was 13 years old, and he was no longer just preparing. He was building. He looked at the stars, the same stars that would one day see his family torn apart if he didn't continue his work. He thought of Lyanna, now 8 and already showing a spirit that could not be contained. He thought of Benyon, 7 and following Ned's lead. He thought of Brandon's fire and Ned's earth. "The pack survives," Kaelen whispered. He turned and walked back into the warmth of the keep. He had the fire in the barrels and the stone on the roads. The transformation was accelerating, and the Northern Star was burning brighter than ever. Chapter 13, The Northern Boom and the White Wolf's Departure. The year 276 AC arrived with a roar of industrial progress that echoed from the wall to the neck. The north was no longer a silent land of frozen forests and starving hamlets. It was a waking giant. Kaelen Stark, now 14 years of age, stood upon the newly reinforced battlements of Winterfell and watched the sun rise over a city that had not existed when he was born. Wintertown was a sprawling metropolis of grey stone and clear glass, its streets paved with the smooth, unyielding concrete that Kaelen had perfected. The population of the north had officially crossed the threshold of 4.6 million souls. This growth was fueled by the absolute food security of the four-field system and the warmth provided by the massive glass gardens. Kaelen ran a hand through his white hair, which he now wore longer, tied back with a simple leather thong. His green eyes were sharp, scanning the horizon with a restless energy that the castle walls could no longer contain. Beside him stood Brandon, his twin, who was already a head taller and possessed the broad shoulders of a seasoned warrior. Brandon was currently sharpening a wolf steel dagger, the rhythmic rasp of stone against metal providing a steady beat to the morning air. "The roads are full, Kay," Brandon remarked, looking down at the heavy wagons moving toward the White Knife. "The traders say the Manderleys are running out of space to store the whiskey and the glass. We are too big for our own skin." "Growth without strength is just a more enticing target for a predator," Kaelen replied. His voice was no longer that of a child, it held the resonance of a man who understood the weight of his own words. "The South is watching us. Tywin Lannister has sent 3 more envoys this moon alone. The Mad King asks for a higher tribute to fund his vanity. They see the gold, but they do not yet fear the wolf." Kaelen turned to his brother, his expression turning cold and clinical. "I have spent 14 years building the mind of the North, Brandon. I have built the forge and the road. But a mind without a fist is a vulnerable thing. I cannot lead a nation of warriors if I have never tasted the copper of blood on my tongue. I cannot command the Winter Guard if they only see me as a scholar of the kill." Brandon stopped his sharpening, his grey eyes narrowing. "You mean to leave? You want to go to the disputed lands?" "I mean to gain a reputation that will make the Sauron lords think twice before they cross the neck," Kaelen said. "I want them to know that the White Wolf is not just a builder. I want them to know that I am the most efficient killer they will ever encounter. We will take 500 men of the guard. We will hire ourselves to the merchant princes of Essos. We will test the wolf steel in the only way that matters." The departure was not a celebratory progress. It was a silent, disciplined march of 500 men dressed in the grey and white of the Winter Guard. They moved along the concrete road toward the new shipyards at Wolf's Gate, their pikes held at perfect intervals. Rickard Stark stood at the gates of Winterfell to see them off. He looked at his 2 eldest sons, seeing the fire in Brandon and the icy, terrifying resolve in Kaelen. "Look north," Rickard reminded them, his voice thick with the grief of a man who had already lost his wife and was now sending his heart across the sea. "I am looking north, father," Kaelen replied, bowing his head. "I am building the wall that will protect it forever." Ned, now 13, stood beside his father. He was the one who would remain to manage the logistics of the construction while his brothers were away. Ned looked at Kaelen with a soulful, worried intensity. He had always been the anchor for his brothers, and the thought of them in the blood-soaked fields of Essos was a weight he could barely carry. "Return to us, Kay," Ned whispered. "The pack is not the same without its mind." "I will return as its teeth, Ned," Kaelen promised. The crossing to Essos was made on the first 3 Wolf Runner galleys. These ships were a testament to Kaelen's engineering. They featured deeper keels and specialized lateen sails that allowed them to outpace the heavy, sluggish cogs of the free cities. When they arrived in the disputed lands, the air was thick with the scent of jasmine, dust, and rotting meat. It was a world of shifting loyalties where the city-states of Tyrosh, Myr, and Lys fought an endless, pointless war for territory. Kaelen did not waste time. He secured a contract with the Archon of Tyrosh to clear a fortified ridge held by the Company of the Cat, a notorious sellsword group known for their brutality. The sellswords laughed when they saw the 500 Northmen arriving in their disciplined blocks. They saw a boy with white hair and thought him a pet for the larger Brandon. They did not laugh for long. The battle took place on a sun-scorched slope near the banks of the Selharu. Kaelen stood at the front of the Winter Guard, his wolf steel longsword held in a relaxed, low guard. He did not use the wild, sweeping strikes of a typical Westerosi knight. His style was based on the biomechanics of his previous life, absolute efficiency of movement, targeting the joints and the gaps in the armor with the precision of a surgeon. When the company of the cat charged, they hit a wall of wolf steel pikes that did not budge. The Northmen moved as one organism, their shields overlapping in a solid barrier of oak and iron. Kaelen waited for the moment of impact. As the first sellsword reached him, a massive man swinging a heavy mace, Kaelen moved. He did not parry the blow, he stepped inside the man's reach, his blade flashing in a short, brutal arc. The wolf steel sheared through the leather and the bone of the man's neck as if it were parchment. Kaelen did not stop to watch the body fall. He spun, his blade catching a second attacker in the gap beneath the armpit. Every movement was a calculation of force and distance. He was a whirlwind of white hair and silver steel, moving through the chaos with a terrifying, silent focus. The White Wraith, a sellsword, screamed as Kaelen cut through his shield and the arm behind it in a single motion. Brandon was nearby, fighting with a wilder, more traditional ferocity, but even he stopped for a moment to watch his twin. Kaelen was not just fighting, he was dismantling the enemy. He moved with a speed that the human eye struggled to follow, his green eyes never losing their cold, analytical light. By the time the sun had reached its zenith, the ridge was covered in the bodies of the company of the cat. The Winter Guard had lost only 3 men. The reputation of the White Wolf began to spread through the camps of the disputed lands like a wildfire. They spoke of a Stark prince who did not feel pain, who did not tire, and who fought with a blade that could cut through the world itself. Kaelen did not discourage the legends. He knew that in this world, a reputation for being a fierce and efficient killer was as valuable as 1,000 extra men. Between the battles, Kaelen did not neglect the northern boom. He spent his nights in his tent, lit by a single candle, reviewing the reports sent from Winterfell. Kaelen Stark had become a primary correspondent, her letters filled with the details of the manganese production and the progress of the new textile mills. The population is 4.7 million now, Kaelen, Alice wrote in a letter that arrived in late 276 AC. The small folk are calling the new concrete road the Wolf's Path. They say it is the only thing in the north that the winter cannot break. I miss our talks in the hall. The maester is getting bolder without you there to stare him down. He tells your father that you will never return from the east. Kaelen wrote back with instructions for the next phase of the irrigation projects. He did not speak of the blood or the heat. He spoke of the limestone and the grain. He was 14, and he was a commander of men, a butcher of sellswords, and the architect of a nation. The final engagement of the year was against a detachment of the Golden Company near the ruins of a Valyrian outpost. The Golden Company were the elite of the sellsword world, and they viewed the Winter Guard as upstarts. They met on a flat plain, their heavy cavalry ready to crush the northern infantry. Kaelen stood at the head of his men. He had equipped the front rank with repeating crossbows, a design he had refined from his memories of ancient history but reinforced with northern spring steel. "Hold," Kaelen commanded, his voice carrying over the sound of the approaching hooves. The Golden Company charged, a wall of gold and steel. At 50 paces, Kaelen dropped his hand. The Winter Guard unleashed a storm of bolts. The wolf steel tips, driven by the mechanical power of the crossbows, pierced the heavy barding of the horses and the plate of the riders. It was not a charge, it was a collision with a wall of invisible lead. In the ensuing chaos, Kaelen led the counter-charge. He targeted the officers, his white hair a beacon in the dust. He found the captain of the Golden Company detachment, a man twice his age and size. The duel lasted less than a minute. Kaelen utilized a redirection of the man's own momentum, slipping past a heavy thrust to deliver a lethal strike to the throat. As the captain fell, the remaining Golden Company soldiers broke and fled. It was unheard of for the company to retreat, but they had never encountered a force that utilized modern tactics and superior metallurgy with such clinical ruthlessness. By the end of 276 AC, Kaelen Stark had achieved exactly what he set out to do. He had gained a reputation as a fierce, lethal fighter whose presence on the battlefield guaranteed victory. He was the White Wolf of the East, a figure of myth and terror in the free cities. He stood on the deck of his galley as they prepared to move further south for the winter contracts. He looked back at the smoke rising from the disputed lands. He felt the weight of the lives he had taken, but he felt no regret. Every sellsword he killed was a lesson learned, a data point in the science of war that he would use to protect the North. "You're different, Kay," Brandon said, joining him at the rail. Brandon was covered in scars and his voice had deepened further, but he looked at his twin with a new kind of awe. "You don't fight like a man. You fight like a machine." "I fight to win, Brandon," Kaelen replied. "And I fight so that one day, no one in the North will ever have to pick up a sword again. But until that day comes, I will be the sharpest blade our house possesses." The year 276 AC was the year the North proved it had the teeth to match its mind. The population was booming, the industry was thriving, and the princes of the North were becoming the most feared warriors in the known world. Kaelen Stark looked toward the horizon, thinking of Ned in the Vale and Lyanna in the nursery. He was 14 years old, and he was just getting started. The transformation was expanding, and the northern star was burning with a cold, fierce light that the world was finally beginning to fear. The reports of Kaelen's exploits began to trickle back to the Seven Kingdoms. In the Red Keep, Varys whispered to the king about a white-haired boy who killed like a god of death. In Casterly Rock, Tywin Lannister read the accounts and narrowed his eyes, realizing that the North was no longer a distant problem. It was a competitor. Kaelen Stark did not care what they thought. He was in the dirt and the blood, refining the art of the kill. He was the architect of his family's survival, and he would ensure that when the winter finally came, the wolf would be the only thing left standing in the snow. Chapter 14, The Return of the Veterans. The year 277 AC marked a profound divergence in the paths of the twin wolves of Winterfell. Brandon Stark, the elder by minutes and the heir by law, returned to the north in the autumn of that year. He came back to a land that was already humming with the rhythmic vibration of the first textile mills and the clatter of heavy wagons on the new concrete roads. Brandon arrived as a hero of the disputed lands, his chest scarred and his name whispered in the taverns of the White Knife as a man who could break a shield with a single blow. But Kaelen Stark, the second son with the white hair and the green eyes of a ghost, chose to remain in the East. At 15, he had determined that a single year of combat was merely a laboratory experiment. To build the terrifying reputation required to secure the northern future, he needed a larger sample size of blood and steel. Kaelen took command of the remaining Winter Guard and spent the next 3 years transforming them from a mercenary company into a legendary fighting force that the free cities began to fear as the Winter Legion. Under his leadership, the group grew from 500 to 1,500 men. He was surgical in his recruitment, selecting only those who possessed the strong, resilient bloodlines of the first men. He pulled recruits from the northern diaspora in the free cities, sought out descendants of the Blackwoods in the Riverlands, and invited younger sons from the mountain clans to cross the narrow sea. These 1,500 men were not mere sellswords motivated by gold. They were a disciplined legion bound by the ancient traditions of the North and the modern tactical brilliance of their commander. They wore breastplates of wolf steel that were lighter and stronger than any plate in the South, and they carried repeating crossbows that could darken the sky with a single, mechanical volley. In the blood-soaked fields of the disputed lands, Kaelen became known as a man of absolute results. He did not engage in the flowery rhetoric of the merchant princes of Tyrosh or Lys. He spoke only to give orders or to dictate terms. During the siege of Myr in 278 AC, Kaelen stood before the city walls and gave the magistrates 10 minutes to surrender or face the wolf's fire. When the sellswords atop the walls laughed at the boy with the white hair, Kaelen did not argue. He utilized a series of primitive, steam-driven catapults to launch jars of stabilized naphtha. The liquid fire turned the main gate and the surrounding barracks into a funeral pyre that burned even on the surface of the water. The city fell within the hour, and the magistrates surrendered their keys to a boy who didn't even look at them as he walked past to secure the archives. His reputation in battle was that of a clinical predator. He did not seek the glory of the duel, he sought the efficiency of the kill. In the Battle of the Painted Hills, he led his 1,500 men against a host of 5,000 Tyrogi mercenaries. Kaelen utilized a pincer movement that funneled the enemy into a narrow ravine where his crossbowmen waited on the heights. He stood at the center of the infantry line, his white hair a beacon of cold death amidst the dust of the east. He moved with a speed that defied the heavy plate he wore, his blade finding the gaps in armor with the surgical precision of a man who viewed the human body as a series of biological vulnerabilities. By the end of the day, the Tyrogi host was a memory, and Kaelen was being called the White Wraith across the continent. He was a man who preferred silence, but when he spoke, the world stopped to listen. While his legend as a commander grew, Kaelen's personal life in Essos became more complex. In the city of Tyrosh, away from the watchful eyes of his father and the rigid morality of the maesters, he allowed himself the human lapses he usually suppressed. During his 3 years in the disputed lands, Kaelen fathered 2 children. The first was a son born to a Bravasi merchant's daughter, a boy with the white hair of a Stark and the sharp eyes of a traitor. The second was a daughter born to a Volantine noblewoman who had been fascinated by the strange, foreign prince. Kaelen ensured both children were provided for with northern gold and guarded by a hidden cell of loyal veterans. He kept their existence a closely guarded secret, knowing that in the Game of Thrones, bastards were both a point of leverage for his enemies and a hidden reserve for his own house. In the north, the 3-year absence of the mind of the Starks put the burden of the northern boom on the shoulders of Ricard and young Ned. Ned, now 14 in late 277 AC, had been prepared to depart for the Vale for his fostering with Jonaran. Brandon's return allowed for this transition. Ned stood on the concrete pier at Wolf's Gate as the Wolf Runner galleys docked, watching the veterans disembark. "You look older, Bran," Ned said, gripping his brother's forearm in the traditional northern greeting. "And you look like you have been buried in ledgers, little brother," Brandon replied, his voice a deep, gravelly rasp. He looked around at the bustling port city of Wolf's Gate, which was growing with the speed of a wildfire. "Kay sends his regards. He says the north is looking too much like a kingdom and not enough like a fortress. He wants more stone on the walls." Ned departed for the Vale shortly after Brandon's return. He travelled with a contingent of the newly returned veterans, arriving at the Eyrie not as a typical highborn foster, but as a representative of a rising industrial power. In the Eyrie, Ned met Robert Baratheon. While Robert was a creature of loud appetites and thunderous laughter, Ned remained the steady and calculating presence Kaelen had trained him to be. He mapped the personalities of the southern lords and the layout of the mountain passes for the secret reports he sent back to Winterfell. The years 278 and 279 AC saw the north reach a critical mass of industrialization. Brandon took command of the Home Guard, expanding it to 5,000 professional soldiers. He utilized the veterans from Essos as the officer corps, instilling a level of discipline that made the northern levies the most feared infantry on the continent. The first massive concrete bridge was completed over the White Knife, an arched masterpiece that allowed for year-round transport of the whiskey, glass, and textiles that were now flooding the southern markets and filling the Stark coffers with unprecedented wealth. In early 280 AC, the White Wolf finally returned. Kaelen Stark was 18, his white hair now a long, striking mane that he kept tied back with a steel ring. He arrived at Wolf's Gate not on a merchant cog, but on his own flagship, the Star of Winter. He found the castle of Winterfell transformed. The concrete wolf project had been completed in his absence. Every major tower was now reinforced with his silicate binder, and the glass gardens covered nearly 10 acres of the surrounding land, glowing like a sea of diamonds in the afternoon sun. He was met at the gates by the entire Stark family. Ricard looked at his second son with a mixture of awe and relief, realizing the boy had returned as a man of war. Brandon, now 18 and the image of a legendary hero, let out a roar of greeting that shook the trees. Lyanna, 13, and Benyon, 12, clung to their brother, marveling at the strange, silver-edged armor he brought from the east. But Kaelin's eyes sought out Kaelen Stark. At 18, she was a woman of the north in its purest form. She had managed the manganese and limestone supply chains for 3 years, becoming the unofficial steward of the eastern industrial sector. "You took your time, White Wolf," Alice said as Kaelen approached her. She did not bow. She stood with her hands on her hips, her grey eyes challenging him as they always had. "The world is a large place, Alice," Kaelen replied, his voice a low and melodic baritone that carried the weight of his 3 years of command. "It took some time to convince the world to stay out of our way." "And did you find what you were looking for in the blood?" she asked, her voice softening just a fraction. "I found that the north is the only place worth standing on," Kaelen said. The wedding was held 3 days later in the Godswood of Winterfell. It was a northern covenant, witnessed by the heart tree and the stone. Kaelen and Alice stood before the red-faced weirwood, wrapped in a single heavy cloak of white wolf fur. "I am the mind of the north," Kaelen whispered, his hand clasped in hers. "But a mind needs a heart to know what is worth building. You are the fire in the hearth, Alice. I give you my steel, my stone, and my word. And I give you the strength of the mountains," Alice replied, her voice steady and clear. "I will be the shield that watches the gate while you build the walls. The pack survives because we do not bend." As they knelt before the black pool, the lords of the north stood in a silent circle of steel and fur. The Karstark resources and the Stark industry were now officially one. The celebration in the Great Hall that night was fueled by the finest whiskey and the newfound prosperity of a nation. But in the quiet corners of the hall, Kaelen sat with Brandon and his father. "The time for preparation is over," Kaelen said, his green eyes reflecting the firelight with a cold intensity. "I have heard the rumors from the south. The Prince of Dragonstone is planning a great tourney at Harrenhal for the coming year. We will go as the power that the Iron Throne can no longer ignore. We will show them our steel, our wealth, and the discipline of our men. We will go so they know what happens when the North wakes up." "Ned will meet us there," Ricard said. "He writes that Robert is eager to see us. The boy has a fixation on Lyanna that I find troublesome." Kaelen's expression darkened. He looked at Lyanna, who was laughing with Benyon near the hearth. Robert Baratheon was a storm, and storms were destructive. But Harrenhal would be the place where the world finally saw the northern star burning with a cold and unyielding light. The year 280 AC was the year the White Wolf returned and the year the pack was finally unified. Kaelen was married, the industry was booming, and the army was battle-hardened. As he walked with Alice toward their chambers, he looked up at the stars through the clear glass gallery. He felt the weight of the coming years, but for the first time, he felt he had a foundation that could survive even the madness of a king. Chapter 15, The Shadows of Harrenhal. The year 281 AC was known to the histories as the year of the false spring, but to Kaelen Stark, it was the year of the calculated risk. The north was no longer a realm of isolated keeps, it was a humming engine of industry connected by a network of concrete roads that pulsed with the movement of trade and steel. Kaelen, now 19, stood in the courtyard of Winterfell as the massive northern delegation prepared to move south. This was not the ragged levy of a poor lord. This was a statement of sovereign power. 200 men of the Winter Guard stood in perfect blocks, their wolf steel breastplates polished to a dark, smoky mirror finish. Behind them sat a train of 50 heavy wagons, their wheels bound in spring steel and their beds loaded with the finest glass, whiskey, and textiles. Kaelen adjusted the fastenings of his own silver-edged armor, his white hair tied back with a ring of Karstark iron. He turned toward the inner gate where Alice Karstark Stark stood. She was 8 moons pregnant with their first child, her condition making the long and jarring journey to the Riverlands a risk Kaelen refused to entertain. Her grey eyes were filled with a sharp and simmering frustration, but she had finally yielded to his logic. "I do not like being left behind to guard the hearth while you dance with the dragons," Kaelen, Alice said, her voice a low and steady rasp. "You are not guarding a hearth, Alice," Kaelen replied, stepping closer and placing a hand over the life kicking beneath her furs. "You are guarding the future of this house. The south is a den of vipers and a dying king's madness. If I am to walk into that pit, I must know that the anchor of the north is safe behind these walls. You have the command of the home guard. If a single raven brings news of trouble, you shut the gates and you wait for the thaw." Alice sighed, her hand covering his. "Just come back to us, White Wolf. The north is a cold place without your numbers to keep it warm." "I will return before the first snow of the child's life," Kaelen promised. The journey south was a revelation to the lords of the Riverlands. As the northern column moved along the King's Road, they did not struggle with the mud or the ruts. Kaelen had sent road crews ahead of the main body months ago, paving the primary route with a temporary traveler's grade concrete that allowed the heavy wagons to move at twice the speed of a traditional caravan. When they reached the ruins of Harrenhal, the scale of the gathering was staggering. Thousands of tents in a riot of colors covered the fields beneath the shadow of the blackened, melted towers. But even amidst the splendor of the south, the northern camp stood out. It was a grid of grey canvas and disciplined silence, fortified by portable wooden palisades and guarded by men who did not drink or bicker with the other camp followers. The opening feast was a display of decadence that Kaelen found both fascinating and repellent. The great hall of Harrenhal was filled with the scents of roasted meats, expensive perfumes, and the underlying rot of the ancient castle. Kaelen sat with his father and Brandon, his eyes scanning the high table. There sat Aerys II Targaryen. The king was a wreck of a man, his fingernails long and yellowed, his hair a silver tangle, his eyes darting with a frantic, paranoid energy. Beside him sat Rhaegar, the Prince of Dragonstone. Rhaegar was the antithesis of his father, beautiful, melancholy, and possessed of a grace that seemed almost otherworldly. The highlight of the early festivities was the elevation of Jaime Lannister. The young Lion of the West, barely 15, knelt before the king in his shining white armor. Aerys, with the twisted smile of spite intended for Tywin Lannister, tapped the boy's shoulders with a blade. "Rise, Sir Jaime," Aerys croaked, his voice cracking with a mad delight. "You are now a brother of the King's Guard. But a king's safety is secondary to his legacy. You will not stay for the games. You will ride tonight for King's Landing. You are to guard the Queen and the young Prince Viserys. I will not have my family unprotected while I am in this den of vipers." Kaelen watched the boy's face fall. Jaime had come to win the tourney, but he was being sent away as a glorified jailer. It was a calculated insult to the Lannisters, and Kaelen saw the way Tywin's jaw tightened in the shadows. The boy left within the hour, his white cloak fluttering like a ghost in the torchlight. During a lull in the music, a small, soft-featured man in robes of silk approached Kaelen. He moved with a subtle, sliding grace, his face a mask of polite curiosity. "Prince Kaelen," the man said, his voice a high, melodic trill. "The whispers from the north have reached even the furthest corners of the Red Keep. They say you have found a way to turn the very earth into stone and the smoke into gold. It is a pity the Lady Alice could not join us to celebrate such wonders." "Lord Varys," Kaelen replied, his expression remaining perfectly neutral. "The whispers in the Red Keep are usually more imaginative than the reality. We simply work hard and value our resources. My wife remains in the north to oversee our interests. She is not fond of the humidity of the south." "Ah, simplicity," Varys smiled, his eyes cold and calculating behind the warmth. "A rare virtue in such complicated times. The king is most curious about your wolf steel. He wonders if such a secret should not be shared with the crown for the safety of the realm." "The safety of the realm is best served by those who know how to use the tools, Lord Varys," Kaelen said. "The secrets of the north belong to the north. Just as the secrets of the Red Keep belong to the shadows." Varys bowed, a tiny, knowing smirk touching his lips. "The shadows are very long this year, Prince Kaelen. I suggest you do not step in them without a light." The tourney began the following day, a spectacle of justing and melee that Kaelen watched with a purely tactical interest. He noted the weight of the southern lances, the fragility of their iron plate, and the lack of coordination in their charges. The matches were a blur of splintering wood and falling knights. Brandon Stark fought with a wild and controlled aggression in the melee, his wolf steel blade making short work of the southern iron. But the highlight of the day was the appearance of the Knight of the Laughing Tree. Kaelen watched the small, mysterious knight unhorse 3 lords who had bullied a crannogman. He saw the way the knight moved, a frantic, desperate energy that he recognized. "It is Lyanna," Ned whispered at his side, his face pale with worry. Ned had met them at the camp, arriving with Robert Baratheon. "I know," Kaelen replied. He looked toward the royal box. Rhaegar Targaryen was watching the small knight with an intensity that made Kaelen's blood run cold. The prince was not just curious, he was captivated. Rhaegar eventually took to the lists himself, riding with a cold and beautiful precision. He unseated Brandon Stark, Jon Royce, and even Sir Barristan Selmy in a display of skill that left the crowd breathless. The final moment of the tourney arrived when Rhaegar was declared the champion. The stadium fell silent as the prince guided his horse past his own wife, Elia Martell. He did not stop. He rode to the foot of the Stark pavilion. With the tip of his lance, he placed a wreath of blue winter roses in the lap of Lyanna Stark. The silence that followed was a physical thing. Kaelen felt the air grow cold as the smile died on Brandon's face and Robert Baratheon's hand went to his warmer. Rhaegar had crowned Lyanna the Queen of Love and Beauty, a public declaration that defied every law of the realm and the heart. The following morning, the king ordered Rhaegar to find the mystery knight. Kaelen knew what was coming. He sought out Brandon and Ned in the quiet of their tent. "The prince is searching for the Knight of the Laughing Tree," Kaelen stated. "And he will find her. We must ensure that when he does, there are witnesses. Or better yet, we must ensure he never finds her at all." Kaelen spent the night in the shadows of the camp, utilizing the observation techniques he had perfected in Essos. He found Rhaegar near the edge of the woods, the prince standing alone with his harp. Kaelen did not hide. He walked into the moonlight, his silver armor shimmering. "It is a beautiful song, Prince Rhaegar," Kaelen said. Rhaegar turned, his violet eyes holding a look of profound sadness. "It is an old song, Prince Kaelen. A song of ice and fire. Do you believe in the songs?" "I believe in the physics of the world," Kaelen replied. "I believe that fire consumes and ice preserves. And I believe that if you try to mix them without a proper vessel, they will both be destroyed." Rhaegar stepped closer, his gaze searching Kaelen's face. "You are the anomaly, Kaelen Stark. The boy who was born with the hair of the winter and the mind of the future. You are not in the prophecies. Perhaps the prophecies are just outdated ledgers, Rhaegar," Kaelen said. "The future is not written in the stars. It is forged in the fire and set in the stone. Stay away from my sister. She is not a verse in your song. She is a wolf of the north, and she will bite the hand that tries to leash her." Rhaegar did not answer. He simply looked at Kaelen with a look of terrifying, quiet understanding. "The winter is coming, Kaelen. And we are all just players in a play we do not understand." The tourney continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. The shadow of the king's madness and the prince's obsession hung over Harrenhal like a shroud. Kaelen stood alone on the final evening, watching the firelight dance across the blackened towers. "We leave at dawn," Kaelen said as Brandon and Ricard joined him. "And Lyanna?" "She comes with us," Kaelen said, his jaw tightening. "The pack stays together. We have shown them our steel. We have shown them our wealth. Now, we go back to the north and we finish the preparations. The game has changed. The false spring is over." As the northern delegation began to pack their tents, Kaelen looked one last time at the Great Hall. He felt the weight of 282 AC looming in the darkness. He had done everything he could to prepare. Kaelen knew that even 10 billion years of knowledge could not stop a heart determined to break the world. He thought of allies, waiting in the safety of Winterfell. He had a son to meet, and a kingdom to save. The year of the false spring was ending, and the White Wolf was going home to prepare for the fire. Chapter 16, The Spark. The year 282 AC did not begin with a roar but with the cold and scratching sound of a quill on parchment. Kaelen Stark, now 20 years of age, sat in the high solar of Winterfell. Beside him, allies cradled their infant son, Ricard II, who had been born in the final weeks of the previous year. The boy had the dark hair of the Karstarks but the unsettling and focused green eyes of his father. Kaelen looked at the child and felt a weight that no amount of wolf steel could offset. He was no longer just a protector of the past, he was the architect of a future that his son would inherit. The peace of the fall spring had vanished, replaced by a winter that felt personal. Kaelen's internal clock was screaming. He had spent the last moon refining the production of wolf's fire, a stabilized version of the naphtha he had used in Essos. But the metallurgy and the chemistry could not stop the human variable. The spark arrived in the form of a blood-spattered outrider from the Riverlands who collapsed in the Great Hall. They took her, the man gasped. Near the crossroads. Prince Rhaegar, he had 10 men. Lady Lyanna, she did not scream. She just looked at us as they rode south. The silence that followed was a physical blow. Brandon, now 20 and a man of terrifying physical presence, stood up from the high table. His hand went to the hilt of his sword, his knuckles turning white. His face was a mask of the wolf blood at its most volatile. "Get the horses," Brandon said, his voice a low and vibrating growl. "Brandon, wait," Kaelen commanded, stepping into his brother's path. "This is a trap. Rhaegar does not do things out of passion, he does them out of prophecy. If you ride for King's Landing now, you are walking into a cage. She is our sister, Kaelen." Brandon roared, his voice echoing off the reinforced granite walls. "He has stolen a Stark daughter. Do you expect me to sit here and calculate the carbon ratios while he defiles her? I expect you to act like a commander of the Winter Guard." Kaelen snapped back. For the first time, the twin bond was a jagged and painful thing. "We have an army of 10,000 Winter Guard pikes and a fleet. We move as a nation, not as a lone rider. If you go there, Aerys will kill you to spite the North's growth. We have the strength to demand her return with a host at our back, not a plea at a madman's feet." Brandon did not listen. He took 20 of his best men and rode out of the gates before the sun had set. Kaelen watched them go from the battlements, a cold and hollow dread settling in his stomach. He knew the history. He knew the floor of the Red Keep would soon be slick with Stark blood if he did not pivot the entire north to a war footing within the hour. Meanwhile, news travelled in other directions. Ned had not returned to Winterfell after Harrenhal, he had travelled directly back to the Vale with Jonaryn and Robert Baratheon. They were at the Eyrie when the world began to burn. Robert was a mountain of undirected rage, his warhammer already strapped to his saddle the moment the news reached the mountains. Ned looked at the moon over the giant's lance, his heart heavy with the fear Kaelen had instilled in him. The disaster in the south happened with a sickening predictability. Brandon arrived at the gates of the Red Keep and shouted for the prince to come out and die. Aerys did not offer a duel. He offered a dungeon. Brandon and his companions were arrested for conspiracy to murder the crown prince. It was only after the iron doors of the black cells slammed shut that the royal ravens flew. The summons reached Winterfell weeks later, demanding that Lord Ricard come to King's Landing to answer for his son's crimes. Ricard Stark looked older than his years, but his resolve was as hard as the concrete foundations of his castle. "I will go to King's Landing to answer the summons," Ricard announced. "But I will not go as a beggar. I will take 5,000 pikes of the professional Winter Guard. If the king wants to judge a Stark, he will do it in the shadow of a northern army." "It is the only way, father," Kaelen said. "But be wary. Aerys is a broken variable. He cares nothing for the rules of engagement. I will remain here to ensure the north remains an unbreakable fortress. As Ricard marched south with a column of steel that stretched for miles, Kaelen stood before the remaining lords in the Great Hall. He officially took command as the regent of the north. "Activate protocol, Wolf's Wall," Kaelen ordered. "Every glasswork and distillery is to be converted to produce war materiel. I want the Wolf Runner fleet to blockade the Narrow Sea. No food or reinforcements from Essos reach the crown. We will starve the dragon before we slay it." Alice stood beside him, her hand resting on the hilt of a dagger as she held their son. She was the anchor of the home front, the one who would manage the factories and ensure the supply of wolf steel and concrete reinforcement continued unabated. The transformation was over. The War of the Northern Star had begun. Kaelen Stark turned away from his family and walked toward the armory. He had a kingdom to lead and a world to break. Chapter 17, The Betrayal of the Dragon. The year 282 AC shifted from a cold tension to a scream of metal and fire. Outside the towering walls of King's Landing, 5,000 men of the professional Winter Guard stood in a silent and terrifying forest of pikes. Lord Ricard Stark sat upon his horse at the head of the column. He looked at the high gates of the Red Keep. The northern host had moved along the concrete roads with a speed that left the Crownlands breathless. They were a wall of wolf steel that the Mad King could not ignore. Ares too looked down from the battlements and saw the discipline of a nation that no longer feared the dragon. Fearing the industrial strength at his gates, the king sent a messenger with a white flag. He offered a parley. He offered the sacred right of bread and salt to Lord Ricard and his inner circle. Ricard Stark was a man of the old ways. He believed in the honor of guest right as firmly as he believed in the Stone of the North. Despite the warnings of his captains, Ricard agreed to enter the city to negotiate the release of Brandon. He rode through the gates with his 20 veterans. He trusted in the ancient laws of gods and men. The betrayal was swift and absolute. Once inside the throne room, the bread and salt were proven to be a mockery. Ares did not want a negotiation. He wanted an execution that would break the spirit of the North. Ricard was suspended from the rafters in his own suit of silver-edged wolf steel. Below him, a pyre of wildfire was ignited. Brandon was brought in with a leather cord around his neck attached to a heavy stone. He was forced to watch his father cook inside the very armor Kaelen had forged. In a desperate and wild attempt to save his father, Brandon strangled himself on the cord. Ricard Stark died as a man of iron, his silence only broken by the sound of the metal popping in the heat. The news of the double execution reached Kaelen at Moat Kaelen via a wraith messenger who had escaped the capital. Kaelen sat in the silent command center, the letter trembling in his hand. He did not roar like Brandon or weep like Ned. He felt a cold and crystalline clarity settle into his marrow. His father was gone. His twin was gone. The biological data points of his family had been erased by a variable he had failed to neutralize. He walked to the map table and struck the icon of the Targaryen dragon with a wolf steel dagger, pinning the parchment to the wood. "He has broken the guest right," Kaelen said, his voice a low and terrifying whisper that chilled the air in the room. "He has traded his life for a moment of cruelty. I will not just kill him. I will erase every trace of his line from the earth." Kaelen acted with the speed of a machine. He drafted a command to the Wolf Runner fleet. He sent a small and fast escort of 5 galleys to the Vale. His orders to Ned were absolute. He called his brother back to the north to secure the home front. He knew that the Vale and the Stormlands would follow, but the north needed its soul to match its mind. In the Eyrie, Jonaran and Robert Baratheon read the report with a mixture of horror and fury. Robert smashed a stone table with his fist, his voice a thunderous roar of grief for his foster father. Jonaran, a man of peace and law, looked at the charred seal of the Starks and felt the world shift. "The king is dead," Jonaran said, his voice heavy with the weight of the coming war. "He has killed the law itself. We raise the banners. We march." Outside the walls of King's Landing, the 5,000 men of the southern expedition did not break. When the gates opened and a royal host of 10,000 men was sent to intercept and slaughter the leaderless Northmen, they met a wall of cold and industrial death. The Winter Guard did not flee. They shifted into the wolf-tooth wedge formation Kaelen had drilled into their souls. For the warden, the captains screamed. The royalist knights charged, thinking to cut through the northern levies. They were met by the mechanical thrum of 1,000 repeating crossbows. The wolf steel bolts tore through their colorful silk and their inferior iron. When the lines collided, the Northmen used their pikes with a rhythmic and clinical precision. It was not a battle. It was a harvest. The northern host slaughtered the royalists to the last man, leaving a carpet of golden roses and crimson lions in the mud. They did not take prisoners. They turned and marched back toward the neck, their footsteps a steady drumbeat of vengeance. Kaelen Stark stood on the battlements of Moat Kaelen and watched the horizon. He was the Lord of Winterfell. He was the Warden of the North. The transformation was complete. The North was no longer preparing for a winter. It was the winter. And the White Wolf was coming for the dragon's head. Chapter 18, The Iron March. The year 282 AC saw the mobilization of a nation the likes of which Westeros had never witnessed. Following the call from the White Wolf, Ned Stark arrived at Wolf's Gate under a heavy naval escort. The reunion between the remaining brothers was brief and devoid of warmth. They were no longer the boys who played in the God's Wood, they were the grieving masters of a war machine. Kaelen, now the Lord of Winterfell, stood before a host of 35,000 men, a mixture of hardened northern levies and the professional Winter Guard. "We do not march for glory, Ned," Kaelen said, his white hair whipping in the wind as they looked over the ranks. "We march for the arithmetic of survival." The reaction of the other great houses was one of stunned disbelief. In Highgarden, Mace Tyrell scoffed at the northern upstarts, but in Casterly Rock, Tywin Lannister remained silent, watching the reports of the northern logistics with a wary eye. The Stormlands had already exploded, Robert Baratheon had raised his banners, his fury carrying him through the battles of Summerhall. However, the sheer weight of the Reach's numbers eventually told. At Ashford, the hammer of the storm was blunted by Randall Tarley. Robert was forced into a fighting retreat, moving north toward the Riverlands with the Royalists snapping at his heels like hounds after a wounded stag. Meanwhile, Jon Arryn led the Knights of the Vale down from the mountains. They moved with a traditional splendor that contrasted sharply with the grey and clinical efficiency of the northern host. The two forces converged near the Trident, creating a pincer that threatened to swallow the Riverlands whole. The momentum of the northern march came to a grinding halt at the Green Fork. The twins, the fortified bridge of House Frey, sat astride the river like a toll-keeper's debt. Lord Valder Frey, ever the opportunist, had closed his gates. He sat behind his high walls, hoping to sell his neutrality to the highest bidder. Kaelen Stark did not request an audience. He did not send a maester with a polite scroll. He rode to the edge of the drawbridge with 500 Wraith sharpshooters, their repeating crossbows leveled at the Frey sentries. "Lord Valder!" Kaelen's voice carried over the rushing water, amplified by the stone throat of the bridge. "You have 10 minutes to drop these chains. If the gates are not open by the time the sun hits that Merlin, I will not just take your bridge. I will raise these towers and ensure the name Frey is scrubbed from every ledger in the 7 kingdoms. I will end your bloodline with the same clinical indifference I used to clear a forest." The Frey archers trembled. They looked at the silver-eyed lord and the 35,000 men behind him who stood in perfect, silent blocks of steel. The threat was not a boast, it was a prophecy. Before the first bolt could fly, a new banner appeared on the horizon, the leaping trout of House Tully. Hoster Tully, a man of sharp political instincts, rode between the two hosts to negotiate. He saw the fire in the north and the steel in the Vale. He knew the dragon was dying. "There is no need for a slaughter today, Lord Stark," Hoster said, his voice tempered with diplomacy. "The Riverlands seek an alliance, not a grave. My daughters are of age. A marriage pact between our houses Tully, Stark, and Arryn would bind the Triple Alliance in blood as well as purpose. In the shadow of the twins, the pact was struck. Ned would wed Catelyn Tully, and Jon Arryn would wed Lysa. Kaelen, already bound to Kaelen Stark, stood as the witness. He cared nothing for the romance of the arrangement, he only cared that the road to Robert was now open. As the North and Vale moved south, they heard Robert Baratheon was in the town of Stony September. He was a man hunted. The royalist forces, emboldened by their victory at Ashford, had cornered him. Kaelin's 5,000 men from the southern expedition, those who had survived the slaughter at King's Landing, finally linked up with the main host. They were soot-stained and grim, carrying the dented shields of the royalists they had broken. "The king's men thought we were retreating," the southern captain reported to Kaelen. "We were merely leading them into the reach of the north." The year 283 AC was the year the Triple Alliance became a juggernaut. With the Riverlands secured and the north unified, the rebel host turned its eyes toward the Trident. Kaelen Stark stood at the head of the column, the northern star shining on his breastplate, ready to prove that the wolf's bite was more lethal than the dragon's breath. Chapter 19, The Battle of the Bells. The bells of Stony September did not ring for a wedding, nor did they ring for a funeral. They rang for the end of an era. Inside the stone walls of the town, the air was thick with the scent of charcoal and fear. Lord John Connington, the Hand of the King, had spent the morning house by house, searching for the wounded Robert Baratheon. He was a man obsessed with the glory of the kill, yet he was utterly blind to the fact that the predator had become the prey. Outside the gates, the silence was broken not by a horn, but by the rhythmic, mechanical thrum of the northern war machine. Kaelen Stark, now the Lord of Winterfell, stood at the head of a unified host 40,000 strong. But it was the vanguard that drew every eye. For the first time on Westerosi soil, Kaelen deployed the Old Guard. These were the original 500 who had bled with him in the disputed lands. They did not wear the colorful surcoats of the south, they wore matte black wolf steel, their faces hidden behind heavy visors, their movements synchronized with a terrifying, professional grace. "Robert is in the Western District," Ned said, his voice taut with the strain of the march. "The town is burning, Kaelen. We must move." "We do not move for Robert, Ned," Kaelen replied, his green eyes reflecting the orange glow of the distant fires. "We move for the arithmetic. Harry, signal the wraiths. Clear the battlements." From the shadows of the nearby Treeline, 300 wraiths, the elite marksmen of the Winter Legion, unslung their repeating crossbows. In a single, coordinated motion, they unleashed a rain of wolf steel bolts. There were no battle cries, only the sound of high-tension winches. The royalist archers atop the walls of Stony September didn't even have time to notch their arrows before they were punched backward by the armor-piercing projectiles. "The gate is an obstacle," Kaelen observed coldly. "Neutralize it." The Old Guard stepped forward, wielding a massive, steam-pressurized cylinder, the prototype for what Kaelen called the wolf's breath. With a hiss of venting steam that sounded like a dragon's dying gasp, the machine launched a specialized wolf bite canister. The projectile shattered against the iron-reinforced oak of the town gate. The explosion of stabilized naphtha turned the entrance into a literal tunnel of fire. The royalist soldiers stationed behind it didn't just die, they were vaporized. As the gate collapsed, Kaelen entered the town. He was flanked by the Wolf Guard, 100 giants of the north, men chosen for their first men's stature, clad in the heaviest black plate ever forged. They carried 6-foot wolf-tail halberds that shimmered with a dark, oily sheen. They moved like a wall of living stone, stepping over the charred remains of the defenders. The battle within the town was not a melee, it was an execution. The royalist host, trapped in the narrow streets, found themselves outmatched by the northern phalanx. When Robert Baratheon finally emerged from his hiding place, he was a man transformed by rage, his war armor swinging in great, bloody arcs. But even his fury was overshadowed by the clinical efficiency of the Old Guard. They moved in squads of 10, clearing buildings with wolf howl flash canisters and short swords, taking no risks and showing no mercy. In the central square, beneath the shadow of the September, Kaelen found John Connington. The hand was surrounded by a dozen of his finest knights, his armor dented and his red hair matted with soot. He saw Kaelen, the white-haired wraith of the north, and raised his sword in a gesture of chivalric challenge. "Lord Stark!" Connington shouted, his voice cracking. "I offer you a parley. In the name of the king and the laws of honor, I offer my surrender and the surrender of my men. We are noble captives." Kaelen did not stop walking. He gestured for the wolf guard to circle the square. The giants moved with silent intent, their halberds leveled. "Honor is a luxury for the living, Lord Connington," Kaelen said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You stood as the hand and the shield while my father cooked in his own armor. You watched as the Mad King broke the bread and salt, the most sacred oath of our land. You did not speak. You did not act. You were a witness to the murder of my house. I followed my king." Connington cried, his eyes darting to the wall of black steel surrounding him. "I am a knight of the Seven. And I am the Lord of the Winter," Kaelen replied. "My math does not allow for a variable as volatile as your loyalty. The bread and salt were broken in the Red Keep, today, the debt is collected in the mud." Kaelen did not draw his sword. He simply raised a hand and lowered it. The wraiths on the surrounding rooftops opened fire. It was not a duel. It was a massacre. The Knights of the Reach and the Crownlands were picked apart in seconds, bolts finding the gaps in their visors and the joints of their plates. John Connington fell last, a bolt through his throat, his honor spilling into the gutter of a town that would forever remember the day the North stopped being kind. "Kaelen," Ned whispered, stepping into the square and looking at the piles of dead. They were trying to surrender. There were nearly 3,000 of them. 3,000 mouths to feed, 3,000 men to guard, and 3,000 variables that could turn against us the moment we march for the Trident, Kaelen said, turning to look at his brother. "I have no room in my logistics for prisoners, Ned. We have a sister to find and a dragon to slay. We march at dawn." Robert Baratheon approached, his hammer resting on his shoulder. He looked at the wolf guard, then at the smoking remains of the royalist vanguard. He saw the world Kaelen was building, a world of iron and fire, where the songs of the South meant nothing. "You're a cold bastard, Kaelen," Robert said, a grim smile touching his lips. "But by the gods, you get results. Let's go kill a prince." The year 283 AC saw the death of the royalist vanguard at Stony September. The toll of the bells was the signal to the realm that the North was no longer fighting for a seat at the table. It was fighting for the table itself. Kaelen Stark stood in the center of the town, his black armored legions behind him, the northern star burning bright in the smoke of a dying kingdom. Chapter 20, The Arithmetic of the Grave. The air above the Trident did not smell of the rushing river water or the early spring reeds that lined its banks. Instead, it was thick with the suffocating scent of coal smoke, the sharp tang of ozone, and the heavy copper smell of impending slaughter. On the southern bank, the sun glinted off the silver and gold armor of Rhaegar Targaryen's host, 40,000 men who marched to the rhythm of highborn songs and ancient prophecies. On the northern bank, Kaelen Stark stood at the head of 75,000 soldiers of the Triple Alliance, a force so vast and grimly equipped that it seemed to swallow the horizon itself. He did not look like a lord of the Seven Kingdoms in that moment. Clad in matte black wolf steel that drank the light, his white hair whipping in the wind like a tattered funeral shroud, he looked like a nightmare forged in the deep foundries of a world the South had forgotten. The history books would later describe Robert Baratheon as the demon of the Trident, a whirlwind of stag-horned fury, but Kaelen Stark knew the truth of his own role. He would be the cold, unyielding math that allowed the demon to strike. He was the architect of the machine that was about to dismantle a dynasty. Beside him, Eddard Stark sat atop his horse, his face a mask of northern stone, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of concern as he watched the old guard wheeling monstrous, iron-clad shapes into position along the muddy banks. Ned observed that the river was running high and deep, warning that any attempt to cross would result in a loss of momentum that the royalists could exploit. Kaelen did not look at his brother, his gaze remained fixed on the silver dragon banners across the water. He replied with a voice that held the chill of a mountain blizzard, stating that they were not merely crossing the river, they were reclaiming it for the north. Kaelen raised a gauntlet hand, and the world seemed to hold its breath. At his signal, the 6 steam-powered artillery pieces known as the Wolf's Breath began to scream. It was not the sound of men or beasts, but a mechanical banshee's wail, a high-pitched venting of pressure that sent a literal shockwave through the air. The royalist horses, unaccustomed to the shriek of industrial death, began to rear and plunge in terror. High-pressure steam pistons snapped forward, launching heavy wolf-bite canisters across the expanse of the river. These projectiles did not explode with simple iron shrapnel. Upon impact with the water's surface, they shattered and released a stabilized naphtha compound that Kaelen's chemists had perfected over years of trial and error. The mixture ignited instantly upon contact with the air and water, and within seconds, the trident was no longer a river, it was a liquid furnace. A wall of emerald and orange flame roared 20 feet into the air, effectively bisecting the Targaryen army. Rhaegar's vanguard, consisting of his most loyal knights and the fierce Dornish spears, was suddenly trapped on the northern side of the fire, cut off from the tens of thousands of Reach infantrymen who were supposed to provide their support. The Prince of Dragonstone found himself staring into a corridor of fire, his retreat blocked and his reinforcements blinded by the smoke. Kaelen did not hesitate. He gave the command for the Iron March to begin. The Old Guard, veterans of 100 skirmishes in the disputed lands, moved with clinical precision. They deployed modular, prefabricated steel and timber bridges, slamming them into the mud and securing them with screw piles. Behind them, the 40,000 men of the northern host began their advance, a rhythmic, bone-shaking stomp of iron-shod boots that drowned out the roaring of the flames. In the center of this iron tide, Robert Baratheon was a force of pure, unadulterated destruction. He was a black-armored titan, his massive warhammer swinging in great, bloody arcs that shattered shields and pulverized breastplates as if they were made of glass. He was the demon of the trident, a man fueled by a decade of repressed grief and the singular desire to wrap his hands around the throat of the man who had stolen his world. But while Robert provided the spectacle of the battle, Kaelen Stark provided the execution. As the hosts collided in the mud and the blood, Kaelen moved toward the southern bank, not to find the prince, but to find the legends who protected him. He did not move with a shouting mob of levies. He moved with the Wolf Guard, 100 giants of the north clad in plate so thick it could turn a heavy crossbow bolt at point-blank range. Prince Luwin Martell, Sir Jonothor Darry, and Sir Barristan Selmy stood as the final barrier between the rebellion and the dragon. They were the finest knights of the age, men whose names were synonymous with the chivalry and honor of the Seven Kingdoms. To the lords of the south, they were invincible icons. To Kaelen Stark, they were simply variables in an equation that needed to be balanced. Luwin Martell, his martell spear glinting in the firelight, shouted a challenge across the mud, accusing Kaelen of hiding behind machines and monsters rather than fighting like a true knight. Kaelen did not slow his pace. He told the prince that he was no knight and that the time for songs had ended. He declared himself the demon wolf and informed the king's guard that they were merely obstacles to be cleared from the path of progress. The ensuing struggle was not a duel that any singer would care to put to music. It was a demonstration of the wraith style of combat that Kaelen had spent years refining in the pits of the east. Kaelen moved with a predatory, deceptive speed that seemed to defy the heavy weight of his wolf steel armor. Jonothor Darry was the first to realize the lethality of his opponent. As the king's guard lunged with his long sword, Kaelen did not parry with his own blade. Instead, he triggered a spring-loaded mechanical blade concealed within his left vambrace, catching Darry's sword in the notch of the steel. Before the knight could react, Kaelen stepped into his guard and drove a wolf steel dagger through the narrow slit of the knight's visor. The sound of steel piercing bone was lost in the roar of the steam artillery, and Darry slumped into the mud without a word. Prince Lewin Martell attacked with the fluid grace of the sands, his spear a blur of motion. Kaelen met the assault not with finesse, but with the brutal physics of the north. He stepped inside the arc of the spear, the wood scraping harshly against his breastplate, and caught the shaft in his gauntlet hand. With a roar of effort and the mechanical advantage of his reinforced armor, he snapped the thick ashwood as if it were a dry twig. Before Lewin could draw his sidearm, Kaelen drove the jagged remains of the spear through the prince's throat and followed the motion with a clinical, backhanded swing of his long sword that severed the man's head. The Dornish soldiers nearby faltered, their courage breaking at the sight of their prince being slaughtered with such terrifying indifference. Baristan Selmy, the boldest of the White Cloaks, was the last to stand. He charged with a desperation that only a man who had outlived his brothers could possess. His steel clashed against Kaelen's in a blinding spray of sparks, the two of them a blur of black and white amidst the red mud. Baristan was a master of the traditional style, his footwork perfect and his strikes precise. However, he was fighting a man who had spent his life analyzing every weakness of the southern martial arts. Kaelen allowed Baristan to overextend on a high thrust, then caught the knight's blade in a cross-guard lock. Using his superior mass and the leverage of his position, Kaelen swept Baristan's legs and pinned the legendary knight to the ground, his sword hovering inches from the veteran's throat. Kaelen looked down at the man beneath him, seeing the soot-stained face of the only truly honorable man left in Aerys' service. He told Sir Baristan that he had wasted his life defending the wrong king, but admitted that he was the only soul on this field worth sparing. Kaelen did not deliver the killing blow. Instead, he signalled to the Wolf Guard to drag the wounded and unconscious Selmy to the rear of the lines, effectively removing him from the history of the Targaryen dynasty. With the King's Guard fallen, the heart of the royalist resistance began to stop beating. The common soldiers looked at the demon wolf, standing amidst the corpses of their legends, and saw a power they could not understand and certainly could not defeat. In the center of the river, the climax of the rebellion was reaching its bloody end. Robert Baratheon and Rhaegar Targaryen had finally found one another in the churning, ruby-streaked waters of the ford. They fought with the desperation of men who knew that only one of them would leave the water alive. Rhaegar fought with the elegance of a prince, his sword fined the gaps in Robert's armor, but Robert fought with the inexorable weight of a collapsing mountain. Finally, as the steam from the wolf's breath swirled around them, Robert swung his hammer with every ounce of his strength. The impact shattered Rhaegar's breastplate, and the rubies that had been sewn into the dragon on his chest scattered into the river like drops of frozen blood. The prince fell into the water, his last breath a whisper of a name that only the river heard. As Rhaegar's body was swept away, the royalist army simply stopped fighting. 40,000 men, including the proud lords of the Reach and the fierce spears of Dorne, dropped their weapons in the mud. The sight of the burning river, the mechanical roar of the artillery, and the demon wolf standing victorious over the King's Guard had utterly extinguished their will to resist. Kaelen Stark climbed atop a mound of discarded Dornish shields as the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the battlefield. He watched as the surviving lords of the south were rounded up by his winter guard and brought before him in heavy iron chains. They looked up at him with a mixture of hatred and profound terror, waiting for the executioner's axe. Kaelen spoke to the assembled lords, his voice carrying clearly over the silent, body-strewn field. He told them that they had chosen to rise for a madman and had stood by while the blood of his family was spilled in the halls of the Red Keep. He noted that while the traditions of chivalry suggested he should ransom them for gold, the rules of his new world dictated that they were a deficit that must be addressed. He then revealed the grand settlement of the Trident, a decree that would fundamentally alter the social and economic fabric of Westeros forever. He informed them that there would be no simple ransoms and no easy pardons. The debt of the rebellion would be paid in full, and it would be paid in the currency of the North. The first part of the decree concerned the common soldiers. Kaelen announced the creation of the Winter Labor Corps. Every common man who had taken up arms for the dragon was drafted into 7 years of mandatory service. They would not return to their farms in the Reach or the Storm Lands. Instead, they would be marched north to dig the great canals that would link the White Knife to the Fever River and build the massive stone greenhouses that Kaelen had designed. They were no longer soldiers, they were the workforce that would ensure the north survived the coming winter. Kaelen looked at the horrified lords and explained that he had no use for dead men, but he had a great deal of use for their labor. The second part of the settlement focused on the nobility. Kaelen declared the wolf's tithe. Every house that had fought at the Trident was required to send their firstborn heir to Winterfell to serve as a ward. These heirs would be educated in the northern style, ensuring that the next generation of southern lords would be loyal to the Stark vision. Furthermore, these houses were ordered to pay 10 years of war reparations, not in gold, but in raw timber and iron ore. This material would be shipped directly to the northern foundries to fuel the production of more steam engines and more wolf steel armor. The north would grow fat and strong on the resources of the south, effectively reversing the traditional flow of wealth in the Seven Kingdoms. To ensure that the professional soldiers among the defeated host did not form the seeds of a future rebellion, Kaelen offered the blood oath branding. Any soldier who wished to avoid the labor corps could volunteer for the Winter Guard's new southern division. However, the price of this service was a permanent brand of a wolf's head on their forearm. This mark would serve as a constant reminder of their new allegiance. If any man with the brand was ever found taking up arms against House Stark again, they would be executed without the benefit of a trial. It was a cold, efficient method of absorption that turned his enemies into his front-line troops, saving the lives of his precious northern veterans for the battles that truly mattered. Finally, Kaelen addressed the land itself. He ordered the territorial cession of half the ancestral lands of every house that had supported Ares. These lands would not be given to the other rebel lords, but would instead be managed by northern administrators appointed by Winterfell. These administrators would implement Kaelen's modern agricultural techniques and industrial practices, ensuring that the productivity of the south was maximized for the benefit of the realm's defense. The Lords of the Reach realized too late that Kaelen wasn't just taking their gold or their honor, he was taking their power, their legacy, and their future. He was dismantling the feudal system and replacing it with a centralized, industrial machine directed from the north. The lords looked at the smoking remains of the Trident, the mechanical monsters that still hissed steam in the twilight, and the black-armored giants of the Wolf Guard who stood ready to enforce the demon wolf's will. They did not attempt to negotiate. They did not cite the laws of gods or men. One by one, the proudest names of the South knelt in the blood-soaked mud of the riverbank and swore their lives and their lands to the new order. The Battle of the Trident was over, but the war for the soul of Westeros had only just begun. Kaelen Stark turned his back on the kneeling lords and looked south toward King's Landing. The dragon was dead, and now it was time to put the Mad King in the ground and claim the justice that the math demanded. Chapter 21, The Blackwater Protocol. The morning sun over King's Landing was a pale, sickly thing, struggling to pierce the heavy shroud of soot and sea mist that had descended upon the capital. From the heights of the Red Keep, the city looked like a sprawled, dying animal, its breath coming in ragged gasps of chimney smoke and the stench of open sewers. But as the bells of the Great September began to toll a frantic, rhythmic warning, every eye turned toward the Blackwater. The horizon did not merely change, it was consumed. A fleet of iron-ribbed leviathans cut through the choppy waters of the bay, their presence a mechanical insult to the traditions of the South. These were not the tall, elegant swan ships of Old Town or the swift dramans of the Royal Navy. They were monsters of steel and coal, their hulls plated in matte grey wolf steel that sat low and menacing in the water. From their blackened chimneys, thick plumes of dark smoke billowed into the sky, joining together to form an artificial storm cloud that cast the harbour into a premature twilight. The sound reached the city before the ships did, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated in the stones of the sea walls and the bones of the men who stood upon them. It was the sound of high-pressure steam engines, a heartbeat of iron that heralded the end of an era. As the northern fleet closed the distance, the last of the Targaryen galleys attempted a desperate sortie. They looked like toys of wood and silk against the ironclads. "Load the long-range canisters," the commander of the lead vessel ordered, his voice echoing through the hollow iron corridors of the ship. Target the hulls. No survivors. The steam-powered ballistay on the decks groaned as they were winched into position, the heavy steel cables taut with lethal energy. With a series of mechanical clangs, the wolf-bite canisters were launched. They did not soar in high arcs like traditional arrows, they flew flat and fast, skimming the surface of the water before slamming into the wooden sides of the royal ships. Upon impact, the stabilized naphtha payloads shattered and ignited. Green and orange flames erupted instantly, fueled by chemicals that burned even hotter when they touched the spray of the sea. Within minutes, the mouth of the Blackwater was a graveyard of burning timber, and the capital was utterly cut off from the world. On the landward side, the atmosphere was even more suffocating. The Great King's Road was a river of grey and black, 75,000 soldiers of the Northern Alliance moving with a discipline that bordered on the supernatural. At the head of the column, the Winter Guard marched in silence, their footsteps a single, thunderous beat that shook the foundations of the city gates. But as the host reached the shadow of the walls, a new banners appeared from the west. Tywin Lannister had arrived. 12,000 Westermen, their crimson and gold armor glinting in the pale light, had moved with a speed that suggested they were eager to be part of the final reckoning. Tywin sat atop a magnificent white charger, his face a mask of golden indifference, as he approached the Lion Gate. He had expected to find a city in chaos, a gate held open by a fearful garrison, and a path to the throne that required only his presence to secure. Instead, he found a wall of black steel. 100 giants of the Wolf Guard stood in a perfect semicircle before the gate, their heavy halberds held at a 45-degree angle. They did not shout challenges, they simply existed, an immovable barrier of iron and muscle. Kaelen Stark rode forward to meet the Lord of Casterly Rock. He did not wear a crown, but the way the light died against his black armor made him look more like a king than anyone Tywin had ever encountered. "You are far from home, Lord Tywin," Kaelen said, his voice flat and amplified by the metal of his gorget. "And you are late to the field." Tywin's eyes narrowed, his gloved hand tightening on his reins. "I am here to ensure the safety of the realm, Lord Stark. I am here to pledge my sword to the cause of justice. The city is unstable, the Mad King is a threat to every living soul within these walls. My men are fresh, and they are ready to secure the Red Keep." "Justice was bought at the Trident," Kaelen replied, his gaze never wavering. "The North paid for it in blood. The Vale paid for it in steel. You sat in Casterly Rock and listened to the reports while we burned. You did not bleed for this city, and you will not claim the spoils of a war you watched from afar." "I am an ally," Tywin hissed, his voice like the scrape of a blade on stone. "Do not mistake my caution for a lack of commitment. The Lannister strength is significant, and it would be wise to have us within the walls rather than without." Kaelen glanced up at the ridges overlooking the gate. There, hidden among the rocks and the winter-killed brush, the wraiths sat with their repeating crossbows. The click of 300 bowstrings being drawn echoed in the sudden silence of the gate. "I have accounted for your strength, Lord Tywin," Kaelen said. "And I have decided it is a risk I will not take. You will stay outside these walls. If a single horse wearing the Lion of Lannister crosses the line I have drawn in the dirt, I will treat it as an act of war. My engines do not care for your house's history or your personal pride. They only care about the target I give them. Do I make myself clear?" Tywin Lannister looked at the black-armored giants before him, then at the silent shadows on the ridges, and finally at the cold, white-haired man who had just threatened the most powerful lord in the south. For the first time in a generation, the Lion of the Rock found himself without a move to make. He gave a sharp, curt nod, his face tightening into a grimace of suppressed fury, and turned his horse back toward his camp. The northern dominance was absolute. Kaelen did not waste time savoring the humiliation of the Lannisters. He turned back toward the mud gate, where the old guard had already positioned the Wolf's Breath steam artillery. These massive machines were the pinnacle of Kaelen's industrial efforts, great iron cylinders braced by steel scaffolding and fed by pressurized boilers that hissed with a dangerous intensity. Pressure readings. Kaelen asked, dismounting and walking toward the lead engineer. Holding at the red line, my lord, the man replied, wiping soot from his brow. The valves are strained, but she'll hold for the cycle. Target the gatehouse hinges and the central bracing, Kaelen commanded. I do not want a breach, I want an erasure. Once the gate is gone, signal the wraiths to begin the infiltration. Ready. Aim, the engineer shouted. Fire. The sound was a physical blow to everyone within a mile of the gate. A massive venting of steam and fire erupted from the artillery as the high-velocity canisters were launched. They struck the mud gate with the force of a falling mountain, the kinetic energy alone shattering the ancient oak beams. But it was the chemical payloads that did the most damage. Upon impact, the canisters released a concentrated burst of naphtha and iron filings that turned the gateway into a white-hot furnace. The stone around the gate began to crack and pop from the sudden, intense heat, and the heavy iron portcullis melted into a twisted mass of slag. As the smoke and heat began to dissipate, Kaelen raised his hand. Wraiths! Go! From the shadows of the nearby buildings and the wreckage of the gate, 300 wraiths moved with the silence of smoke. They did not engage the fleeing gold cloaks or the terrified citizens. Their mission was urban surgery. They had maps of the city's secret tunnels and the locations of the Alchemists' Guild. Kaelen had calculated the risk of Ares's wildfire plot long ago, and he had no intention of allowing the city to become a funeral pyre. The wraiths moved through the streets in small, lethal squads, their dark grey cloaks blending into the soot-stained walls. At the Guildhall of the Alchemists, they found the pyromancers preparing the final torches. There was no dialogue, no demand for surrender. The wraiths used their repeating crossbows to put a bolt through the head of every man wearing the green robes of the guild. By the time the first northern infantrymen reached the square, the threat of the wildfire had been neutralized by the cold efficiency of the shadow warriors. The Red Keep was a labyrinth of fear as Kaelen Stark entered the great hall. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale incense, and the sharp, metallic scent of blood. He walked through the doors with the rhythmic, heavy tread of his wolf steel boots, followed by 20 of his wolf guard. The giants in black plate fanned out, their halberds creating a corridor of iron that led directly to the throne. Near the foot of the Iron Throne, Jaime Lannister stood like a golden ghost. His sword was in his hand, dripping with the dark blood of Rossart, the last of the king's alchemists. Jaime looked up as Kaelen approached, his eyes wide and unfocused, haunted by the realization of what he had almost been forced to witness. He wanted to burn it all, Jaime whispered, his voice cracking. He told me to bring him his father's head. He told Rossart to light the caches. I know, Sir Jaime, Kaelen said, his voice unusually soft. My men have already secured the Guildhall. The fires will not be lit today. On the Iron Throne itself, Ares II Targaryen was a pathetic sight. He was a skeleton wrapped in tattered silk, his skin the color of old parchment and his hair a matted, silver mess that reached his waist. His fingernails were like yellowed talons, scratching frantically at the blades of the throne as he shrieked at the shadows. The White Wolf! Ares screamed, his voice a high, thin reed of madness. I'll burn you! I'll turn your ice to steam! I am the dragon! I am the fire made flesh! Kaelen stopped at the base of the throne. He did not look at the king with anger, nor did he look at him with pity. He looked at him as a man looks at a broken machine that can no longer be repaired. You are nothing but a memory, Ares, Kaelen said. A dark dream that the world is waking up from. You broke the laws of the gods and the laws of men. You murdered my father in cold blood. You strangled my brother while you laughed. You thought your crown made you untouchable, but you forgot that every action has a consequence. I am the king. Ares wailed, spit flying from his lips. You cannot judge me. I am the blood of Valyria. The dragons are dead, Kaelen replied, drawing his long sword. The wolf steel blade hummed as it left the scabbard, a low, resonant sound that seemed to fill the room. And the wind does not care for the titles of the fallen. You are a debt that must be settled, and I have come to collect. Kaelen did not wait for a final plea. He did not allow the king to speak another word of madness. With a single, clinical thrust, he drove the point of his blade through the center of Ares's chest. The king gasped, his eyes bulging for a brief moment as the steel found his heart, and then he slumped forward, his blood pooling in the notches of the Iron Throne. The Targaryen dynasty, which had begun in fire and blood 300 years ago, ended in the same fashion, silenced by the cold steel of the north. The hours that followed were a whirlwind of logistics and command. Kaelen secured the Princess Elia Martell and her children, placing them under the direct protection of the Wolf Guard in the Magur's Holdfast. He knew that the Dornish would be looking for a reason to bleed the realm, and keeping Elia safe was the only way to ensure their cooperation. He also ordered the systematic disarmament of the Gold Cloaks and the establishment of a northern governorship to manage the city's resources. In the solar of the hand, Kaelen found Ned sitting by the window, looking out over the smoking ruins of the Mud Gate. Ned looked as if he had aged a lifetime in a single day. The weight of the justice they had claimed seemed to sit heavy on his shoulders. "Is it enough, Kaelen?" Ned asked, not turning around. "We have the city. We have the throne. We have the king's head. Is it enough to make up for what we lost?" Kaelen walked to the table and spread out a map of the Red Mountains of Dorne. "It is the beginning of the end, Ned. But our family is not yet whole. We still have a sister to find." Ned turned then, his eyes sharpening with a sudden, desperate hope. "You know where she is?" "The Wraiths have been tracking the movements of the King's Guard for months," Kaelen said, pointing to a small, isolated spot on the map. "The Tower of Joy. Arthur Dayne and Oswell Went are there. They would not be guarding an empty tower while their king died." Kaelen looked at his brother with an uncharacteristic gravity. "I have prepared the expedition. 200 of our finest veterans, 10 of the North's best maesters, and a retinue of servants and supplies. You will lead them, Ned. You are the White Wolf, the South needs to see your face, to know that the Starks are not just bringers of fire and steel, but of life as well." "And you?" Ned asked. "The Demon Wolf must stay to guard the den," Kaelen replied, looking out toward the horizon where the Lannister fires were still burning. "Tywin is still out there, waiting for a moment of weakness. The Lords of the Reach are looking for a way to save their titles. I must hold the gates and ensure the peace we bought is not stolen from us in the shadows." He handed Ned a heavy, leather-bound case. "Inside are the latest medical drafts from our alchemists and the tools the maesters will need. If Lyanna is unwell, do not wait for a messenger. Use the supplies. Bring her home, brother. Bring her home alive." Ned gripped the case, his knuckles white with the intensity of his promise. He didn't need words to express his gratitude. He stood, his grey eyes burning with a new purpose, and walked out of the room to lead his men toward the south. Kaelen stood alone in the solar, the first flakes of a true winter drifting past the window. He had conquered the capital, he had executed a king, and he had outplayed the most dangerous man in the Seven Kingdoms. But as he listened to the distant sound of Ned's horses galloping out of the city gates, Kaelen knew that the hardest part was still ahead. The great winter was coming, and the living were still too busy fighting over the ashes of the old world to realize that the dead were already marching. He turned back to the map, his mind already beginning the long, cold process of preparing the realm for the darkness that no machine could stop. Chapter 22, The Tower of Life and the Lion's Leash. The sun over the Red Mountains was a relentless, punishing weight that seemed to press the very breath from a man's lungs. Eddard Stark adjusted the leather strap of his helm, feeling the gritty sensation of Dornish dust between his skin and his armor. Behind him, the rhythmic clatter of 200 horses and the heavy, grinding wheels of the medical wagons provided a steady cadence to the heat. This was not the lonely, desperate ride he had imagined during the long nights on the Trident. He was not accompanied by a handful of lords and friends, but by a specialized detachment of the Winter Guard. They were men handpicked by Kaelen, silent and disciplined, their matte black armor reflecting the harsh glare of the southern sun. "The scouts report the tower is just over the next ridge, Lord Eddard," Howland Reed said, his voice low and rasping from the dry air. The Cranagman looked out of place in the desert, yet his eyes were as sharp as ever, scanning the jagged rocks for any sign of an ambush. "3 men wait at the base. They do not look like they intend to move." Ned nodded, his heart tightening in his chest. "Kaelen told me they would be there. He said the white cloaks would hold their ground until the world ended or their vows were fulfilled." He looked back at the wagons, where the maesters sat with their strange, glass-shielded lanterns and boxes of sterilized tools. Kaelen had spent a fortune and a decade of effort to ensure that this expedition was prepared for every possibility. It was not a quest for glory, it was a mission of clinical recovery. As they crested the ridge, the Tower of Joy rose from the earth like a jagged, lonely tooth of stone. It stood solitary against the burning blue of the sky, a monument to a prince's obsession and a sister's disappearance. At its base, 3 figures stood in a pool of shade, their white cloaks fluttering in the hot wind like the wings of dying birds. Even from a distance, Ned recognized them. They were the legends of his youth, the finest blades the 7 kingdoms had ever produced. Sir Arthur Dane, the Sword of the Morning, Sir Oswell Went, and the Lord Commander himself, Sir Gerald Hightower. Ned raised his hand, signaling his host to halt 50 paces from the tower. The 200 Northmen fanned out in a wide, professional arc, their black shields forming a wall of iron that contrasted sharply with the white of the King's Guard. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the shifting of horses and the distant, haunting cry of a hawk. Ned dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry soil, and walked forward until he was within speaking distance of the 3 knights. "I looked for you on the Trident," Ned said, his voice steady despite the thunder in his chest. "We were not there," Sir Gerald replied. The Lord Commander stood like an ancient oak, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. "Woe to the usurper if we had been," Sir Oswell added, a grim smile playing on his lips as he continued to run a whetstone over his blade. Ned looked at Arthur Dane. The man was a vision of chivalry, his pale sword dawn resting its point in the dirt. "King's Landing has fallen. The Mad King is dead, executed by my brother's own hand. Sir Jaime has been spared, and the city is held by the North. I have come for my sister, Sir Arthur. There is no need for more blood to be spilled. I have maesters with me, healers who can ensure the safety of everyone within that tower." "The King's Guard does not flee," Arthur Dane said, his voice as clear as a mountain spring. "Then or now. We swore a vow, Lord Eddard. A vow that does not end because a king has fallen or a city has changed hands." "You are 3 against 200, Ned pointed out, his eyes glancing toward the tower's high window, from which a thin, pained cry suddenly drifted. The sound cut through him like a knife. "My sister is suffering. Let us pass, and I promise you that you will be treated with the honor your service deserves." "Our honor is not found in surrender," Sir Gerald said firmly. Arthur Dane lifted Dawn, the blade shimmering with a light that seemed to drink the Sunday, and now it begins. "No," Ned whispered, "now it ends." The battle was not a duel of poets, it was a collision of philosophies. The 3 King's Guard fought with a grace that was almost supernatural, Arthur Dane moving like a streak of white light amidst the red dust. But they were not fighting 7 men, they were fighting a coordinated machine. The Winter Guard did not charge blindly. They moved in small squads, using their heavy shields to pin the knights and their long pole arms to keep the legendary blades at a distance. It was a brutal demonstration of the logic Kaelen had instilled in his troops. When Sir Oswell lunged, he found not one opponent, but a wall of steel that shifted to absorb his strike while 3 other blades sought the gaps in his plate. He fell under the weight of numbers, his white cloak stained red before he could even draw a second breath. Sir Gerald fought like a lion, his strength forcing back the northern line, but even the White Bull could not overcome the relentless pressure. He was brought down by a volley of specialized crossbow bolts from the rear, dying with his hand still reaching for the tower door. Finally, only Arthur Dane remained. He was a whirlwind of destruction, dawn carving through steel and bone as he stood alone against the world. He moved with a beauty that brought tears to Ned's eyes, a remnant of a world that was dying to make room for the one Kaelen was building. But beauty was no match for the northern strategy. Howland Reed used a net of weighted cord to tangle the knight's legs, and as Arthur stumbled, the Winter Guard moved in. Ned stepped forward, his own blade meeting dawn in a shower of sparks. With a heavy heart, Ned delivered the final, merciful strike. "The vow," Arthur whispered as he fell into the dust, his eyes looking toward the high window. "The vow." Ned did not wait. He turned and shouted for the maesters. "The tower. Now!" While the dust settled in Dorne, King's Landing was waking up to a new reality. A week had passed since Kaelen had executed the Mad King, and the city was under an iron peace. The fires of the Trident had cooled, and the remnants of the Triple Alliance had finally reached the capital. Robert Baratheon, Jon Arryn, and Hoster Tully rode through the mud gate, which was now a gaping maw of scorched stone and twisted metal, a testament to the power of the wolf's breath. Robert Baratheon looked around the city with a mixture of awe and growing frustration. He saw northern soldiers on every street corner, their black armor polished and their discipline absolute. There was no looting, no chaos, no celebration. It felt less like a liberated city and more like a massive, open-air factory. "By the gods, Kaelen," Robert boomed as he entered the great hall of the Red Keep. His voice echoed off the high ceilings, shaking the dust from the tapestries. He stomped toward the long table where Kaelen sat, surrounded by scrolls, ledgers, and a dozen scribes. "You took the city before I could even find my boots. And they tell me you killed the old dragon yourself. I wanted his head on a spike of my own making, but I suppose I can't complain about the results." Kaelen did not look up immediately. He finished marking a ledger, his quill scratching rhythmically against the parchment. When he finally looked at Robert, his eyes were cold and focused. "The city is secure, Robert. The wildfire caches have been located and neutralized. The treasury is being audited, and the gold cloaks have been disarmed. You are the king now, and I have prepared the foundation for your reign." Jon Arryn stepped forward, his face etched with the weariness of the long march. "Kaelen, you have done the realm a great service. But we have received word from the south. Storm's End still holds, but Stannis and his garrison are starving. Mace Tyrell's host is vast, and the Red Wine fleet has the bay locked tight. We must take the army and break the siege immediately." Hoster Tully nodded. "My men are tired, but they will march for the Baratheon seat. We cannot allow the war to linger while your brothers suffer, Robert." Kaelen set his quill down and leaned back, his white hair ghost-like against the dark wood of his chair. "The northern host will not be marching south. My men have crossed the continent, fought the Trident, and occupied this city. They require rest, and I require their presence here to ensure the transition of power is handled with the proper weight." Robert's brow furrowed. "Then who is going to save my brothers? I'll lead a host of Stormlanders if I have to." "No," Kaelen said, his voice dropping to a level that commanded absolute silence in the hall. "You are the king. You do not go chasing after a man like Mace Tyrell who has spent the entire war feast tourneying in the Reach. You have a resource sitting outside your gates that is currently doing nothing but consuming supplies and dreaming of a glory they missed." Jon Arryn realized what Kaelen was suggesting before the others. "Tywin Lannister." "Exactly," Kaelen said. "Tywin arrived too late for the battle and was denied the sack of the city. He is a predator who has been humiliated, and a humiliated predator is a danger to everyone in this room. He is desperate to prove his worth to the new regime, to wash away the stain of his indecision. Send him to Storm's End. Tell him that if he breaks the siege and brings Mace Tyrell to his knees, his place in the new order will be considered." "It's a masterstroke," Hoster Tully whispered. "It forces the Lannisters to bleed for us. It keeps them away from the capital while we settle the laws. And if Mace Tyrell fights back, it is the South that suffers the casualties, not our veterans. Tell Tywin the commission is his, Kaelen added, looking at Robert. Let the lion prove his claws on the rose. It keeps him occupied, and it saves your brothers without costing us a single northern life. Robert let out a booming laugh, slapping his hand on the table. Gods, you're a cold one, Kaelen. I like it. Send the Lannister to do the dirty work. Jon, see to the orders. Tell Tywin if he isn't marching by dawn, I'll find someone else to take Casterly Rock. In the upper chamber of the Tower of Joy, the air was thick with the scent of blood and the sharp, medicinal tang of northern tinctures. Ned Stark knelt by the bed, his hand gripping Lyanna's. She was as pale as the winter snows, her breathing a shallow, desperate rasp. But she was alive. The northern maesters moved with a clinical intensity that was alien to the south. They had set up glass-bottled drips of wolf's heart, a potent mixture of alchemical stimulants and cleansing salts. They used sterilized steel needles to stitch the tears that would have otherwise claimed her life. They did not pray, they worked. Ned. Lyanna whispered, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at the infant in the arms of a nearby servant, a boy with dark hair and the solemn eyes of a Stark. His name is Aegon. But Rhaegar, he believed, the prophecy. Hush, Lya, Ned said, his voice breaking. The maesters say you are stabilized. You're going to live. We're going to take you home. Promise me, Ned, she gasped, her fingers digging into his palm with a sudden, frantic strength. Robert, he'll kill him. He hates the dragons. You have to save him. Promise me. Ned looked at the child, then at the maesters who were monitoring the levels of the strange fluids entering his sister's arm. He realized then that Kaelen had known. Kaelen had sent the healers not just to save his sister, but to ensure that the secret she carried had the chance to survive. He had calculated the cost of this moment long before Ned had even left the Eyrie. I promise, Lya, Ned whispered. I promise. The headmaster stepped forward, checking Lyanna's pulse. The fever is breaking, Lord Eddard. The drafts have stopped the internal bleeding. She is exhausted, and the recovery will take months, but the danger of the bed of blood has passed. Your brother's preparations saved her life. Ned let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked out the window at the desert below, where his 200 soldiers were already preparing for the long journey back. To the north, the world was changing. A king had died, a city had fallen, and a new era of iron and logic was rising. But here, in this lonely tower, a life had been saved, and a promise had been made that would echo through the generations. Chapter 23, The Iron Settlement. The doors to the royal solar swung open with a heavy thud. Eddard Stark stepped into the room, his clothes stained with the red dust of the Dornish mountains and the grey mud of the King's Road. The air inside the chamber was thick with the smell of spilled wine and roasted meats. Robert Baratheon sat at the head of the great table. Kaelen Stark stood by the window, his black armor absorbing the morning light. Robert looked up, a massive grin splitting his bearded face. Ned. By the gods, you made it back. Tell me you brought her. Tell me Lyanna is here. Ned stopped in the center of the room. He felt the crushing weight of the lie he was about to tell, a lie that would define the rest of his life. He looked at Robert, seeing the desperate hope in the eyes of his friend, and then he looked at Kaelen. His older brother's face was a mask of cold iron, giving nothing away. I am sorry, Robert, Ned said, his voice cracking perfectly. She is gone. The silver goblet slipped from Robert's hand. It clattered against the stone floor, spilling dark red wine that pooled like blood. The giant of the Stormlands stood up, his chair scraping violently backward. No, Robert whispered, shaking his head. No, the dragon took her, but we killed him. We won, Ned. She cannot be gone. The fever took her, Ned lied smoothly, drawing on the deepest reserves of his northern stoicism. We found her in the tower. The king's guard fought to the last man, but we were too late. She was already slipping away. Her body is being prepared with salts and ice by the maesters. We will take her bones back to the crypts of Winterfell, where she belongs. Robert let out a sound that was half sob and half roar. He slammed his heavy fists onto the table, splintering the polished wood. He cursed Rhaegar Targaryen, he cursed the gods, and he wept openly for the girl he had fought a war to win. Kaelen remained perfectly still by the window. He allowed Robert his grief, knowing that this specific pain was the final cement needed to secure the Baratheon loyalty to the Stark house forever. Hours later, the king had retired to his chambers to drown his sorrow in arbor gold. Ned walked down the winding stone corridors of the Red Keep until he reached the chambers Kaelen had claimed for himself. He knocked once and entered. Kaelen was seated at a drafting table, inspecting a blueprint for a high-pressure boiler. "You lied to the king," Kaelen observed without looking up from his parchment. "I kept a promise to our sister," Ned replied, closing the heavy oak door behind him and locking it. "She lives, Kaelen. And she has a son." Kaelen set his quill down and finally turned to face his brother. "I suspected as much. The medical teams I sent were instructed to prepare for a complicated birth. The drafts of the wolf's heart were synthesized specifically to stop postpartum hemorrhaging. Is the boy healthy?" "He is healthy," Ned said, feeling a sudden flash of anger at his brother's clinical tone. "He is a child, Kaelen, not a project. Rhaegar believed he was the prince that was promised. Lyanna named him Aegon. I told the world he is my bastard, and I will call him Jon." "Jon is a good, northern name," Kaelen said softly. The coldness faded from his eyes for a brief moment. "You did well, Ned. You protected her, and you protected the boy." Robert would have crushed the child's skull against a wall if he knew the truth. "Rhaegar's obsession with prophecy nearly destroyed our family, but the boy is a Stark in blood. He is a piece of the North, and he will be protected behind our walls." "What happens now?" Ned asked, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion. "Now," Kaelen said, rolling up the blueprint, "we secure the realm so that we can go home." The following morning, the Great Council was convened in the throne room. The air was tense and silent. Mace Tyrell, Jon Arryn, Hoster Tully, and Tywin Lannister sat around the long council table. Kaelen Stark stood at the head, dictating the terms of the new world. "The crown is heavily in debt, and the realm is broken," Kaelen began, his voice echoing off the high stone walls. "We will not rebuild using the fragile systems of the past. From this day forward, all major trade will operate under the Northern Standard. We will issue wolf coin, backed by the industrial production of the Winterfell foundries. The South will provide raw labor and agricultural yield." Jon Arryn leaned forward, his brow deeply furrowed. "The Lords will call this tyranny, Lord Stark. To dictate trade so precisely goes against every tradition of the Seven Kingdoms. Tradition allowed a mad king to burn my father alive while the realm watched," Kaelen replied coldly. "Tradition causes the South to starve during long winters while the North survives on its own grit. We are not here to preserve tradition, Lord Arryn. We are here to ensure survival." Kaelen turned his pale eyes toward Mace Tyrell. "Lord Tyrell, the Reach will no longer act as an independent breadbasket. 30% of your annual grain yield will be diverted to the new long-term silos in the north. In exchange, the Reach will receive the exclusive rights to purchase northern agricultural machinery. Our steam-powered plows and harvesters will double your remaining crop yields within 5 years." Mace Tyrell wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and nodded quickly. "House Tyrell accepts these generous terms, Lord Stark." Tywin Lannister sat perfectly rigid, his golden eyes unblinking. "And what of the West?" "I broke the siege at Storm's End for King Robert." "You secured your own survival, Lord Tywin," Kaelen corrected him. "House Lannister stayed behind its walls while the alliance bled." As the price of your neutrality, 30% of all Lannister gold output will be sent to White Harbor for the next 20 years. Furthermore, your firstborn grandson will be fostered at Winterfell to learn the logic of the machine. You expect me to surrender a third of the rock's wealth? Tywin asked, his voice like grinding stones. I expect you to pay your debts, Kaelen answered evenly. Sign the contract, Lord Tywin, or the Winter Guard will march on Casterly Rock to collect the balance in person. Tywin looked at the heavily armored giants of the Wolf Guard standing by the doors. He reached for the quill and signed the parchment in absolute silence. There is one final matter, Jonaran said, clearing his throat. Princess Elia Martell and her children, and the pregnant Queen Rilla on Dragonstone. The king wishes for their swift execution to secure the throne. There will be no murder of children, Kaelen stated with absolute finality. Princess Elia and her children will ride north with me. They will live as my wards at Winterfell. Dorne will remain at peace because their blood is safe with the wolf, and the Iron Throne will remain secure because the Targaryen claim is locked in a cage of ice. And the Queen on Dragonstone? Hoster Tully asked. Queen Rilla and young Viserys will be escorted to the free cities by northern agents, Kaelen decreed. They will be stripped of all titles and forced to live as commoners under constant surveillance. The Citadel will take custody of any future male heirs to forge them into maesters. Their bloodlines will be neutralized by strict oaths of service and celibacy. Dead princes become martyrs, my lords, but fostered exiles become footnotes. The coronation of Robert Baratheon took place 2 days later inside the Great September of Baelor. It was a spectacle of sharp contrast. The September was packed with southern nobility wearing bright silks and ancient jewels. The honor guard lining the main aisle was the Winter Guard. They stood in their matte black plate armor, looking like iron statues unearthed from a brutal age. Robert walked toward the High Septon, looking like a powerful titan. Kaelen and Ned walked beside him. As the heavy crown of gold and rubies was placed onto Robert's head, the city bells began to ring. Their chiming was instantly drowned out by the thunderous roar of the Northern Fleet in the harbor. The ironclads fired a synchronized volley of blank steam canisters, shaking the ancient stone foundations of the Great September. Robert stood and his voice boomed through the hallowed halls. Let it be known across the 7 kingdoms. For his service, his foresight, and his protection of the realm, I name Kaelen Stark the Warden of Winter. He is the shield of the North and the ultimate keeper of the realm's heat. His word on the preparations for the coming cold is the absolute law of the crown. The return journey to the north felt like a long-awaited homecoming. The air turned sharp and biting the moment the host crossed the swamps of the Neck. Ned rode beside the heavily reinforced carriage where Lyanna rested in secret. She was sitting up, her beautiful face slowly regaining its natural color. In her arms she held the infant boy Jon. Princess Elia and her children traveled in the carriage directly behind them, looking out at the strange grey landscape with wide eyes. The profound transformation of the north became undeniable as they reached the towering gates of Winterfell. The horizon was an endless forest of tall brick chimneys. The sound of heavy industry was a constant low-frequency hum that vibrated deep within the frozen earth. Massive stone warehouses lined the main approach, and the newly paved roads were crowded with steam-powered wagons transporting coal from the distant hills. Inside the main courtyard, the true heart of Winterfell waited. Kaelen Stark stood near the ancient stones, holding young Robb securely in her arms. Ned dismounted quickly and pulled his wife into a desperate embrace. He carried a massive secret that would surely haunt his dreams forever, but here in the cold air of home he felt he could finally breathe. A few paces away stood Kaelen Stark, the Lady of Winterfell. She wore a heavy cloak of dark wool tailored perfectly against the biting cold. Her sharp eyes reflected the fierce intelligence that Kaelen relied upon. Standing beside her was a nursemaid holding their young son. The boy was the living legacy of the new world they were building together. Kaelen walked toward his wife and stripped the heavy steel gauntlets from his hands. He kissed Alys on the forehead and looked down at his son. "You have been gone too long, my lord," Alys said, a rare warmth in her voice. The foundries have not stopped burning for a single day. The iron quotas are met, and the new steam plows are already being distributed to the western farms. The world required adjustment, allies, Kaelen replied, feeling a genuine smile pull at the corners of his mouth. You have done incredible work. You are the true heart of the North. Kaelen did not allow himself to linger for long. He kissed his son once more and walked straight toward the great forge with allies right by his side. He was immediately met by his head engineers. Kaelen spoke with an animated tone as he discussed pressure valves and the required high-grade alloys for the next production run. The engineers showed him detailed blueprints confirming the Great Canal construction was fully 30% complete. The first moon back in the north was an absolute blur of frantic activity. Ned handled the daily administration of the vast lands. Kaelen focused entirely on his heavy duties as the Warden of Winter. He oversaw the massive expansion of the glass gardens, turning them into enormous hubs of climate-controlled food production. He finalized the brilliant designs for the underground steam pipes that would keep the entire winter town from freezing over. Lyanna was kept safely in the highest and warmest chamber of the glass gardens. Elia Martell and her young children were given a luxurious and warm wing of the main guest house. Their quiet presence served as a living bridge between the cold north and the distant south. Kaelen visited Lyanna only once before the year finally turned. He stood by the clear window of her warm chamber and watched the snow falling heavily over the glowing foundries. Is he truly safe here, Kaelen? Lyanna asked, holding the sleeping infant close to her chest. He is safe, Lya, Kaelen answered softly. The south is far too distracted by its own feasts to ever look north. By the time they realize what we have built, it will be too late for them to challenge it. The book concluded its final pages as a massive black raven arrived from the frozen wall. The Night Watch reported that the unnatural cold was moving and spreading rapidly. Kaelen read the dark report in the absolute silence of his solar. The bright light of a steam lamp reflected in his pale eyes. He did not look afraid. He looked completely ready. He picked up a quill and began to draft the immediate orders for the very first armored transport to be sent north to Castle Black. The era of the machine was now the only thing standing between the realm of the living and the long night. Chapter 24, The End of the Beginning. Author's note, the end of the beginning. To my dear readers. We have reached the end of our first great campaign together. We marched alongside Kaelen Stark from the glowing foundries of Winterfell to the blood-stained waters of the Trident. We watched the demon wolf shatter a 300-year-old dynasty with steam and heavy steel. We stood in the great September of Baelor as the Iron Settlement was forged and the Warden of Winter claimed his rightful crown to protect the realm from the coming cold. Writing this first iteration of the story has been an absolutely incredible experience. Your support and enthusiasm fueled the fires of this project from the very first chapter. However, as I plotted the future of the North and the looming threat of the long night, a profound realization took hold of my mind. The story of Kaelen Stark is far too massive to be contained within our current boundaries. His journey is not simply about winning a brief rebellion or building a few steam engines to humble the southern lords. It is a sprawling and deeply emotional saga about a man burdened with the knowledge of gods trying desperately to protect his fragile family from a freezing apocalypse. It is about the unconditional love of a mother, the fierce bond of twin brothers, and the lifetime of sacrifice required to drag a broken world out of the Dark Ages. To truly do justice to the White Wolf and the legacy of his pack, I must build his foundation properly from his very first breath. What we have experienced so far was merely the prototype. It is time to ignite the true forge. I am officially concluding this current storyline to launch the definitive and vastly expanded epic. I invite every single one of you to move over to my brand new novel titled Northern Star. The Northern Star will be a massive 5-book saga spanning nearly a century of Northern history. We are starting fresh from the exact moment of his rebirth in the freezing ancient keep. You will intimately experience his childhood alongside his twin brother Brandon. You will feel his deep love for his mother Lyra and his quiet understanding with his younger brother Ned. We will explore his legendary and bloody years in Essos, his enduring marriage to Alyscar Stark, and the true step-by-step industrialization of the entire North. The world will be richer and far more detailed. The emotional stakes will be much higher. You will feel his triumphs and you will weep at his losses. The pack will be larger and the coming winter will be darker than ever before. I want to thank you all for standing by me during this initial run. Now it is time to stoke the fires hotter than we ever thought possible. Please head over to the new novel. Chapter 1 is already waiting for you. The cold is coming, but the White Wolf has finally awakened, and his true preparations have just begun. The pack survives. With deepest gratitude. I am the Dictator. New chapter is coming soon. Write a review.